Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. Moving into a new place is supposed to be a fresh start, a clean slate. That's what I told myself as I pulled my car up the cracked driveway of the old house on Sycamore Lane. Its paint was peeling and the shutters hung crooked, but there was a charm to it, a stubborn kind of beauty that drew me in when I first saw it online. Or maybe I was just desperate. After the divorce, I couldn't afford much, and this place was dirt cheap. The realtor, Mrs. Kearns, was overly cheerful when she handed me the keys. "It's a wonderful neighborhood," she chirped, her wide smile faltering slightly. "Old houses like this have so much character." Character. That's one way to describe it. The house loomed over me as I unloaded the last box from my trunk. The sagging roofline and weathered facade gave it the appearance of something alive, like it was watching me. I shook the thought away. It was just a house after all. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and something faintly metallic. The hardwood floors groaned under my weight as I moved from room to room, taking it all in. The ceilings were high, with ornate crown molding that hinted at the house's former grandeur. But the walls were scuffed, and the wallpaper in the dining room was peeling in long, curling strips. I spent the rest of the day unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home. By nightfall, I had managed to set up my bed, a couch, and a small TV in the living room. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the couch with a bottle of wine and my phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media until my eyes grew heavy. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, a soft creak coming from upstairs. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The house was old, settling, I reminded myself. I went back to my phone, but the sound came again, louder this time. It was unmistakably the sound of footsteps. I stood, clutching my phone like it was a weapon, and crept toward the staircase. "Hello?" My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the house's silence. There was no reply, no movement. I told myself it must have been my imagination, or maybe an animal in the attic. Still, I locked my bedroom door that night, just in case. The next morning, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Grayson. She was a petite woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. She stood on her porch, pruning a row of wilting flowers, and waved me over. "You're the new tenant?" she asked, not unkindly, but with a curious tilt of her head. I nodded. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday." She hesitated, her pruning shears hovering mid-air. "You know about the house, don't you?" "Know what?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "People don't stay there long. Always something strange going on." She set the shears down and wiped her hands on her apron. "The last tenant ran out of there in the middle of the night, babbling about voices and footsteps. Said he felt like he was being watched." I forced a laugh, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. Probably just an overactive imagination. Old houses make weird noises. "Maybe," she said, though the look she gave me suggested she didn't believe that for a second. "Just be careful." As I walked back to my house, her words clung to me like cobwebs. I tried to shake them off, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But that night the sounds returned. It started with the creaking floorboards again, faint but deliberate. Then came the whispering. It was so soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, straining to make out words, but the whispers always faded the moment I focused on them. The following day, I found a book tucked away in the built-in shelves of the study. It was old, its leather cover cracked, and the title embossed in gold letters, The Occult Compendium. My fingers tingled as I flipped through the pages, filled with diagrams of strange symbols and instructions for rituals I couldn't begin to understand. At the back of the book, I found a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Unfolding it, I saw a name scrawled in jagged handwriting, Samuel Reed, the original owner. Beneath his name were the words, "Open the door and it will come." I stared at the paper, a chill running down my spine. Open the door? What door? And what would come? I didn't sleep much that night, every sound amplified in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be coming from right outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded as I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. But it didn't. In the morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house, creaking and settling. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. But deep down, I knew something was. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on me, heavier with each passing day. And I was only just beginning to understand why. I woke up groggy, the restless night clinging to me like a bad hangover. Sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds, but it did little to lift the oppressive weight I felt in my chest. The whispers and creaking footsteps from the night before played on a loop in my head, making me question my sanity. It's just an old house, I told myself for the 100th time. Old houses make noises. I decided to distract myself by getting things in order. My kitchen was still in chaos, with boxes stacked against the walls and my coffee maker buried somewhere underneath them. I dug through the clutter until I found it, along with a chipped mug I had brought from my old place. I poured myself a cup, the bitter warmth grounding me momentarily. The morning passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was never anyone there. By midday, I resolved to learn more about the house. I didn't want to admit it, but Mrs. Grayson's words had stuck with me. People don't stay there long. What had happened to the previous tenants? And what about Samuel Reed, the man whose name was scrawled in the book I found? I couldn't let it go. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. I decided to pay a visit to the local library. It was a small brick building on the edge of town, with a faded sign that read Crestwood Public Library inside. The air smelled of paper and dust, and the librarian, an older man with thick glasses, greeted me with a polite nod. "Can I help you find something?" he asked. "Yes, actually," I said, keeping my voice casual. "I just moved into the house on Sycamore Lane, and I'm curious about its history. Do you have any records on it?" His expression shifted, his friendly demeanor faltering for a brief moment. "Sycamore Lane. That's the old Reed house, isn't it?" "I think so," I replied, surprised that he knew the name. "Why?" He hesitated, then gestured for me to follow him. We walked to the back of the library where rows of dusty file cabinets stood. He pulled open one of the drawers and began rifling through its contents. "That house has a bit of a reputation," he said without looking up. "Samuel Reed built it back in the early 1900s. He was a strange man, kept to himself, didn't socialize much. There were rumors about him, though. People said he was into unusual practices." "Unusual how?" I asked, though I already had an idea. "Occult stuff. Seances, rituals, that sort of thing. Some people claimed he was trying to summon something." He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. "These are the records we have. Newspaper clippings, mostly." I sat at a nearby table and began sifting through the papers. One headline caught my eye. "Local man found dead in mysterious circumstances." The article was dated 1923 and detailed the death of Samuel Reed. He was found in the attic of the house, his body surrounded by strange symbols drawn in chalk. The coroner couldn't determine a cause of death, and the article hinted at foul play but offered no concrete answers. There were other clippings too, stories of tenants leaving the house after only a few months, complaining of strange noises, cold spots, and an overwhelming sense of dread. One particularly chilling account described a man who claimed he saw shadowy figures moving through the halls at night. I closed the folder, my hands trembling. This couldn't be real. It was just urban legend, a collection of ghost stories that had taken on a life of their own. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something I didn't understand. When I returned home, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. I set the folder on the kitchen table and poured myself a drink, trying to calm my nerves. But as the evening wore on, the unease only grew. That night, the noises started earlier. The footsteps were louder, more deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pacing the upstairs hallway. I sat on the couch, clutching a blanket, my eyes glued to the ceiling. Then came the whispering again, low and insistent, like a voice carried on the wind. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I checked each room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but they were all empty. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the attic. The pull-down ladder hung in the hallway ceiling, its cord swaying gently. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. Every instinct screamed at me to go back downstairs, to lock myself in my room and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something compelled me to reach up and pull the ladder down. The steps creaked as I climbed, the beam of my flashlight dancing across the dusty attic. The air was freezing, my breath visible in the pale light. At first, I saw nothing but old boxes and cobwebs. But then my flashlight landed on something that made my blood run cold. Drawn on the floor in faded white chalk was a circle filled with symbols I didn't recognize. They were jagged and intricate, spiraling inward toward a central point. In the middle of the circle was a small wooden box, its surface carved with more of the strange symbols. I approached it cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. The box felt unnaturally cold when I picked it up, and as I opened it, I was hit with a wave of nausea. Inside was a bundle of blackened feathers tied together with a piece of red string. Beneath it was a slip of paper with the same jagged handwriting I had seen in the book. "Do not disturb." I dropped the box, the sound echoing in the empty attic. A sudden gust of icy wind blew through the space, extinguishing my flashlight. I stumbled backward, panic gripping me as the darkness closed in. And then I heard it, the sound of breathing, deep and ragged, coming from somewhere in the attic. I bolted down the ladder, slamming it shut behind me and locking myself in my bedroom. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I sat on the bed, clutching my knees to my chest, too terrified to move. Whatever I had disturbed, it wasn't happy, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to let me go so easily. The next morning felt surreal, like waking up from a vivid nightmare only to find traces of it lingering in the waking world. My bedroom door was still locked, the heavy dresser I'd pushed in front of it awkwardly askew. Sunlight streaming through the windows did little to erase the memory of the breathing in the attic, the icy wind, and the ominous warning etched on that cursed piece of paper. "Do not disturb." I couldn't bring myself to go back into the attic. The box, the symbols, the strange feeling in the air, it all felt too overwhelming. Instead, I focused on something I could control. I made coffee, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled as I poured it into my mug. The house was silent now, but the silence didn't feel comforting. It was charged, heavy, like the space itself was waiting for something. I decided to do what I always did when things felt out of control: find a task, distract myself, and pretend everything was fine. The kitchen still needed organizing, and the boxes in the living room weren't going to unpack themselves. I busied myself with rearranging furniture and unpacking dishes, trying to fill the space with normalcy. Around midday, the doorbell rang. The sharp chime startled me so badly that I dropped a plate, the shattering porcelain echoing through the quiet house. My pulse quickened as I wiped my hands on a dish towel and made my way to the door. It was Mrs. Grayson again, clutching a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic. She gave me a warm smile, but her eyes darted toward the house behind me, her expression tinged with unease. "I thought I'd check on you," she said, holding out the plate. "New neighbors don't come around often, and, well, I figured you could use a little something sweet." "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. "That's really kind of you." She hesitated, her eyes scanning my face. "You look pale. Is everything all right?" I wanted to lie, to tell her everything was fine and send her on her way, but something in her tone made me pause. Maybe she knew more than she was letting on. Maybe she could help. "Actually," I said slowly, "I was wondering if you could tell me more about this house. You mentioned before that people don't stay here long." Her smile faltered. She glanced over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one else was around before stepping closer. "I shouldn't be talking about this," she whispered, "but I suppose you have a right to know." She lowered her voice further. "There's something wrong with this house. Always has been. My husband and I have lived next door for 40 years, and in that time, I've seen more tenants come and go than I can count. Some left without saying a word in the dead of night. Others, well, they weren't so lucky." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach nodding. She hesitated, wringing her hands. "The last family that lived here, 3 years ago I think it was. A young couple with a little boy. They were nice people, quiet, kept to themselves. But after a few months, the wife started acting strange. She said she could hear voices at night coming from the attic. Her husband didn't believe her, thought it was just her imagination. But then the little boy started talking about a man he called Mr. Black. Said he lived upstairs and didn't like it when they made too much noise." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened to them?" "They left," she said simply, "in a hurry. One night, the husband came banging on our door, his wife screaming in the background. He wouldn't say what happened, just kept asking if they could stay with us for the night. The next morning, they packed up their car and drove off. I haven't seen them since." I swallowed hard, the memory of last night's encounter flashing through my mind. The breathing, the cold, the ominous symbols. "What about Samuel Reed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you ever meet him?" Mrs. Grayson's expression darkened. "No, that was long before my time. But people around here still talk about him. They say he was into some dark things, rituals, sacrifices. He was convinced he could communicate with spirits, maybe even control them. When he died, some folks said he got what he deserved. Others thought he might have left something behind." "Left something behind?" I echoed. She gave me a pointed look. You're a smart young man. I'm sure you can figure out what I mean. That night I couldn't sleep. Mrs. Grayson's words replayed in my mind, mingling with the memories of what I had seen in the attic. I stayed in the living room, the TV on for background noise, though I wasn't really paying attention. Every creak, every groan of the house sent a jolt of fear through me. Around 3 a.m. the noises started again. It was subtle at first, a faint tapping like fingers drumming against wood. Then the footsteps began, heavy and deliberate, moving slowly down the upstairs hallway. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped directly above me. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only silence. And then, as if in answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice. And then they went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to navigate the pitch-black room. The air felt colder, thicker, as if the house itself was pressing in on me. The footsteps resumed, this time descending the stairs. My breath caught as I aimed the flashlight toward the staircase, the beam trembling as much as my hand. But there was nothing there. And then I heard it, the same raspy breathing I'd heard in the attic, now just a few feet away. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A presence, heavy and malevolent, watching me from the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with the weight of whatever malevolent thing lurked in the house pressing down on me? The flashlight on my phone eventually died, plunging me into total darkness. I stayed huddled on the couch, gripping the nearest blunt object I could find, a metal candlestick, like it could somehow protect me from the invisible threat. By dawn, the house was quiet again. The oppressive chill in the air had lifted, but the tension hadn't. I knew I couldn't go on like this, pretending I could just ignore whatever was happening. I needed answers. After bolting out the front door and taking several deep breaths of fresh air, I decided to call in sick to work and spend the day digging into the house's history. There had to be records somewhere, property deeds, old articles, something that could shed light on Samuel Reed and the dark rumors surrounding him. The local library seemed like the logical place to start. It was a small brick building with an old-fashioned charm, complete with creaky wooden floors and the faint scent of musty books. I explained my situation to the librarian, an older woman with a kind face and a knack for finding obscure information. She didn't seem surprised when I mentioned the address. Ah, the Reed House, she said, shaking her head. That place has quite the reputation. What are you looking for exactly? Anything you have on the original owner, Samuel Reed, I replied. And anything about strange occurrences there. Her expression grew serious. Follow me. She led me to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the library filled with old newspaper archives and historical records. As she pulled out a few files and handed them to me, she hesitated. You know, she said quietly, some things are better left buried. Samuel Reed was not a good man. Be careful with what you find. I nodded, though her words didn't deter me. If anything, they made me more determined. For the next several hours, I combed through yellowed articles and faded photographs, piecing together the story of Samuel Reed. He had purchased the house in the late 1800s, back when the town was little more than a cluster of farms and dirt roads. By all accounts, he was a reclusive man who rarely left the property, his only visitors being those who shared his interest in the occult. One article from 1896 detailed a series of strange events reported by neighbors. Livestock disappearing without a trace, strange lights and chanting coming from the house late at night, and rumors of bizarre rituals conducted in the attic. Reed was never formally accused of anything, but his name became synonymous with fear and suspicion in the town. The most chilling find was an old photograph of Samuel Reed himself. He was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and piercing eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. Even in black and white, his expression exuded an unsettling mix of arrogance and malice. I was about to pack up when I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a police report from 1901, detailing the night of Reed's death. According to the report, neighbors had heard blood-curdling screams coming from the house and called the authorities. When they arrived, they found Reed's body in the attic, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in what appeared to be blood. The report mentioned a journal found near his body, filled with cryptic writings about summoning the others and opening a doorway. A doorway to where? My hands shook as I read the final sentence of the report. Asterisk, the journal was taken into evidence but later disappeared under mysterious circumstances. It was never recovered, asterisk. I returned home that evening with a mix of dread and determination. As much as I wanted to leave the house and never look back, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to confront whatever was happening. The first thing I did was head back to the attic. My heart raced as I climbed the creaky stairs, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the top, my breath was visible in the beam of light. The box was still there, sitting ominously in the center of the attic. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to pulse in the dim light, as though alive. I hesitated before stepping closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I forced myself to approach, crouching down to examine it more closely. The lid was slightly ajar, as though inviting me to look inside. Against my better judgment, I reached out and lifted it. The inside of the box was lined with black velvet, and nestled within was an object that sent a jolt of terror through me. A journal, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Samuel Reed's journal. I picked it up with trembling hands, the weight of it feeling far heavier than it should have. As I flipped through the pages, my fear deepened. The writing was erratic, the words scrawled in a frantic, almost desperate hand. Most of it was indecipherable gibberish, but certain phrases stood out. Asterisk, the veil is thin here. Asterisk, asterisk, they are watching. Asterisk, asterisk, the doorway is open. Asterisk, and then near the end, a final chilling entry. Asterisk, do not disturb the box. To do so is to invite them in. Asterisk, as if on cue, a loud thud echoed from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. And then the breathing started. It was the same raspy, labored sound I had heard the night before, but this time it was closer. Much closer. The flashlight flickered, casting the attic into intermittent darkness. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound, but the beam of light revealed only shadows. Who's there? I demanded, my voice trembling. The breathing grew louder, more insistent. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by darkness. But its eyes glowed an unnatural, sickly yellow, piercing through the gloom and locking onto mine. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the journal. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. The air around me grew icy, and I could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This isn't real. But it was. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long and claw-like. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The flashlight stopped flickering, the attic was silent once more, and I was alone. Or so I thought. From somewhere deep within the house, I heard the sound of footsteps. They were heading toward me. The footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their heels. My heart raced, each beat a deafening thud in my ears. I stayed frozen in the attic, clutching Samuel Reed's journal like it was some kind of shield. The sound grew louder, closer, until it reached the base of the attic stairs. I held my breath, straining to hear any other movement. But instead of ascending the steps, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, a suffocating void filled only by the pounding of my heart. I waited, praying for it to be over, for whatever was out there to leave. But then a new sound emerged, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, like the warning of an animal ready to pounce. I scrambled backward, bumping into the dusty walls of the attic. The journal slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The growl turned into a guttural chuckle, something so inhuman it made my skin crawl. And then the stairs creaked. One by one, the wooden steps groaned under the weight of something unseen, something making its way up. Stay away, I whispered, my voice shaking as I pressed myself further against the wall. The creaking stopped just short of the attic door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door handle rattled violently, as if whatever was on the other side was testing it, trying to see if it was locked. It wasn't. The door swung open with a loud crash, slamming against the wall. I raised the flashlight, its weak beam trembling as much as my hands. But the doorway was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing visible anyway. The oppressive cold deepened, sinking into my bones, and the air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing against me. The flashlight flickered again, its light dimming to almost nothing. And then I felt it, a presence. It wasn't something I could see or hear, but I could feel it, standing there watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in fear. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like an eternity. Eventually, the oppressive weight began to lift, and the room warmed slightly. The flashlight stopped flickering, holding steady once more. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the far corner of the attic. Leave? I didn't wait to be told twice. I bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get out of the attic. The house seemed alive around me, the walls groaning and the floorboards creaking as though the house itself was protesting my escape. I ran straight out the front door, slamming it behind me, and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and climb inside. I sat there for a long time, staring at the house, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. It looked so normal from the outside, its faded white paint and sagging porch giving it an almost quaint, harmless appearance. But I knew better now. This house was anything but harmless. I didn't go back inside that day. Instead, I drove aimlessly around town trying to clear my head. But no matter where I went, the sense of being watched lingered, like something from the house had latched onto me and followed me out. I found myself parked in front of the library again, drawn back to the one place where I might find answers. The librarian was gone for the day, but the records room was still open. This time, I focused on the journal, trying to decipher its cryptic contents. The more I read, the more my unease grew. Samuel Reed hadn't just dabbled in the occult. He had been consumed by it. The journal described rituals, offerings, and invocations meant to thin the veil between worlds. Reed believed the house was built on a nexus point, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was weaker. One passage stood out, written in large, jagged letters that took up an entire page. Asterisk, the watchers are always near. They hunger. They wait. Asterisk. I shivered, the words sending a chill down my spine. Below them was a crude sketch of what Reed called the others. It was the same figure I had seen in the attic, tall, skeletal, with glowing yellow eyes. The journal also mentioned the box, describing it as both a ward and a trap. Reed had created it to contain something, though he didn't say what. The only clue was a single phrase scrawled in the margins. Asterisk, do not open, for what is within cannot be tamed. Asterisk. My stomach churned as I realized what I had done. By opening the box, I had unleashed whatever Reed had tried to contain. As night fell, I knew I couldn't avoid the house forever. My things were still inside, and as much as I wanted to abandon it all, I couldn't bring myself to leave without at least trying to retrieve them. I returned just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The house loomed before me, its dark windows like empty, watching eyes. The air felt colder as I stepped inside, and the familiar creaks of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate. The house was alive again, and it knew I was there. I grabbed a duffel bag from the hall closet and started packing as quickly as I could, stuffing clothes and essentials inside with shaking hands. But as I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whisper started again, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. Why? Stay? Help. I froze, clutching the bag tightly. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, swirling around me like a malevolent storm. And then, from the direction of the attic, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps. They were coming for me. The footsteps descended from the attic, slow and deliberate, the creak of each wooden step reverberating through the house. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs felt as though they'd turned to stone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, as if the house itself was speaking to me. Why did you come? Run. Stay with us. I backed away, clutching the duffel bag to my chest. My gaze flicked to the front door. It was only a few feet away. I could make it. I just had to move. But my body refused to cooperate, frozen in fear as the footsteps continued, one by one, closing the distance between us. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick and oppressive, like the house was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a raspy, guttural voice, impossibly close, whispering right into my ear. Why are you leaving? I screamed, dropping the duffel bag and bolting for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, trembling so violently that it took me several tries to turn the deadbolt. Finally, the door swung open and I stumbled outside, gasping for air as I slammed it shut behind me. I ran to my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, my eyes locked on the house. Its dark windows stared back at me, empty and unblinking. But then, in the upstairs window, the one in the attic, I saw it. A shadowy figure, tall and skeletal, with glowing yellow eyes that burned like embers, was watching me. My hands shook as I started the engine, the roar of the car breaking the suffocating silence. I tore out of the driveway, not daring to look back. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had I unleashed? Why had Samuel Reed built that box? And most importantly, How was I supposed to stop whatever was in that house? Eventually, I found myself parked outside a diner on the edge of town. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pale red glow over the empty parking lot. I needed to clear my head to figure out my next move. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress who looked like she hadn't slept in days and an elderly man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. I slid into a booth near the window, my back to the wall, and ordered a coffee I didn't intend to drink. The journal was still in my hands, its worn leather cover now smudged with dirt and sweat. I opened it again, flipping through the pages in search of answers. Near the end of the journal, I found a passage that sent chills down my spine. Asterisk, to break the bond, one must confront the watchers. They feed on fear, thrive on despair. They cannot be destroyed, only appeased. But beware, the cost is steep and the price is eternal. Asterisk, the watchers. That's what Reed had called them. The figures in his drawings, the thing I had seen in the attic. I tried to wrap my head around it, but the words felt slippery, like they were trying to escape my grasp. The waitress brought my coffee, startling me out of my thoughts. She lingered for a moment, her eyes flicking to the journal in my hands. "Is that about the old house on Maple Street?" she asked, her voice low. My heart skipped a beat. "You know about it?" She nodded, glancing around the empty diner as if to make sure no one else was listening. "People around here don't talk about it much. Bad things happen there. Always have." "What kind of bad things?" I pressed, leaning forward. She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's just, people don't last long in that house. Tenants move in and within weeks they're gone. Some leave in the middle of the night, too scared to even pack their things. Others," she trailed off, her gaze distant. "Others what?" She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Just, be careful. That house doesn't let go easily." I returned to the house the next day, though every instinct screamed at me to stay away. But I couldn't leave, not yet. Something about the journal, the rituals, the watchers, it all felt unfinished, like I was part of something much bigger than myself. The house was eerily quiet when I stepped inside, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. The whispers were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. I made my way to the living room, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The words from the final pages echoed in my mind. Asterisk, to break the bond, one must confront the watchers. Asterisk, but how? How was I supposed to confront something I couldn't even see? As if in response to my thoughts, the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly that I could see my breath. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, deeper, as though they were alive. And then, from the depths of the silence, came the voice. "You cannot escape." It was everywhere and nowhere, a low, resonant growl that made my skin crawl. I turned in circles, my flashlight casting frantic beams of light across the room. The shadows shifted and twisted, and for a brief moment I saw them, the watchers. Tall, skeletal figures with glowing eyes, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They surrounded me, their presence overwhelming. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The cold seeped into my bones, and my vision blurred as the room seemed to tilt and spin. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The shadows receded, the temperature rose, and the oppressive weight lifted. But the words from the journal lingered in my mind. Asterisk, the cost is steep, and the price is eternal. Asterisk, I knew then that this wasn't over. Whatever I had unleashed, whatever bond one had broken, it wasn't going to let me go. The silence of the house was deceptive. It cloaked the malevolent force within, masking its presence as I stood in the living room, still gripping the journal. My body ached from the tension of the last encounter, but I knew leaving wasn't an option anymore. Not after what I had seen, and what I had felt. The watchers had revealed themselves, if only for a moment, and the memory of their skeletal forms and burning eyes was seared into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always there, just beyond my peripheral vision, watching and waiting. I flipped through the journal again, desperate for some kind of instruction, a clue that would tell me what to do next. The final pages were filled with fragmented sentences, scrawled in a hurried hand that spoke of desperation and fear. Asterisk, the ritual must be completed. Asterisk, asterisk, do not let the bond remain broken. Asterisk, asterisk, they will not stop. Asterisk, the ritual. Samuel Reed had been trying to finish something, and it was clear he hadn't succeeded. The watchers were still here, still tethered to this house. And now, somehow, I was caught in the middle of it. The next morning, I decided to do more digging into the house's history. If the journal didn't hold all the answers, maybe the local library or town records would. The library was a dim, dusty building that seemed as old as the town itself. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, raised an eyebrow when I asked about the house on Maple Street. That place, she said, her voice tinged with disdain. What do you want to know about it? Anything you have, I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. I'm living there now and I've heard some strange stories. She gave me a long, appraising look before sighing and disappearing into the back room. When she returned, she was carrying a thin folder labeled Maple Street, Property History. Be careful with this, she said, sliding it across the counter. And be careful with that house. It's not like other places. I nodded, taking the folder to a nearby table. The records were sparse, deeds of sale, a few photographs, and a handful of newspaper clippings. But what little information there was painted a grim picture. The house had been built in the late 1800s by Samuel Reed, a recluse known for his interest in the occult. Several of the articles mentioned rumors of seances and rituals, though none provided any concrete details. One clipping from 1902 caught my attention. Local man found dead in Maple Street home. Authorities baffled by mysterious circumstances. The article described Reed's death as unexplained, noting that his body had been found in the attic, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in chalk. The coroner's report stated that he had died of a heart attack, but the article hinted at something more sinister. Another clipping, dated 1927, detailed the disappearance of a family who had moved into the house. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the middle of the night, but by the time authorities arrived, the house was empty. The family's belongings were still inside, untouched. The more I read, the more the unease in my chest grew. This house had a history, a long, dark history filled with tragedy and fear. And now I was a part of it. That night, I sat in the living room with the journal and the folder spread out before me. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of another encounter. I had decided to confront the watchers, to finish whatever ritual Samuel Reed had started. But how? The journal mentioned symbols and chants, but the instructions were vague, almost cryptic. I tried to replicate the drawings as best I could, sketching the symbols onto the wooden floor with chalk. My hands trembled as I worked, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me. When the symbols were complete, I stood in the center of the circle, clutching the journal. The words on the page seemed to shift and blur, but I forced myself to read them aloud. Ad sumus vigilibus, accipimus pactum. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, my breath fogging in the air. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching toward me like dark, grasping hands. Ad sumus vigilibus, accipimus pactum, I repeated, my voice shaking. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. And then, from the darkness, they emerged. The watchers. Their skeletal forms moved with an unnatural grace, their glowing eyes locked onto me. There were more of them now, their numbers seemingly endless as they filled the room. My knees threatened to buckle, but I held my ground, clutching the journal like a shield. What do you want? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. One of them stepped forward, its bony hand outstretched. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to echo inside my skull. The bond is broken. Restore it? I don't know how, I said, my words coming out in a rush. Tell me what to do. The watcher tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. The cost is steep, it said. The price is eternal. Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones and stealing the air from my lungs. I felt hands, cold, bony hands, grasping at me, pulling me deeper into the void. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. I was lying on the floor, gasping for breath, the room bathed in an eerie, flickering light. The symbols on the floor were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The watchers were gone, but their words lingered in my mind. The cost is steep. The price is eternal. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Whatever bond one had broken, whatever ritual I had begun, it was far from complete. The watchers were waiting, and they wouldn't wait forever. I woke up on the living room floor, the faint glow of the symbols on the wooden board still flickering like dying embers. My body felt heavy, as if I had been carrying a weight far beyond my strength. The journal lay beside me, its pages open to a blank section where new words had appeared overnight, written in the same hurried, frantic hand. The bond must be restored before the third moonrise. To delay is to welcome them fully. The vessel is chosen. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. Third moonrise? Vessel. What did any of it mean? I could feel the oppressive presence of the watchers lingering even in their absence. The room was colder than it should have been, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I grabbed my phone and opened the calendar, frantically counting the days. If my understanding was correct, the third moonrise was just 2 nights away. That gave me less than 48 hours to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. I didn't know where to begin, but one thing was clear. I couldn't do this alone. Later that morning, I decided to visit Marjorie, my next-door neighbor. She had been in the town for decades and clearly knew more about the house than she had let on during our last conversation. When she opened the door, she looked surprised and a little wary to see me standing there. "I need your help," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. Marjorie's expression softened. She stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. Her house was a stark contrast to mine. Warm, inviting, and filled with the comforting smell of freshly brewed tea. We sat at her kitchen table, and I wasted no time explaining what had been happening. The watchers, the journal, the strange occurrences, I laid it all out, half expecting her to call me crazy. But to my surprise, she listened intently, her face growing paler with each word. When I finished, she sighed heavily and stood, walking over to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. She returned with a faded photograph and a folded piece of paper, both of which she placed on the table in front of me. The photograph was of a man I recognized immediately from the journal, Samuel Reed. His piercing eyes and thin, sharp features seemed to stare straight through me, even from the aged image. The paper was a newspaper clipping, dated 1985. The headline read, "Local teen dies in mysterious circumstances at Maple Street House." "My cousin," Marjorie said quietly, her voice heavy with sorrow. "He was just 17. He and some friends broke into the house one night, thinking it would be fun to explore. They didn't know what they were walking into." "What happened?" I asked, my throat dry. "They found him in the attic the next morning," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she folded and unfolded a napkin. "His body was twisted like something had crushed him. The others swore they saw shadows moving, heard whispers. But no one believed them. The official report said it was an accident, that he fell. But I knew better." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Samuel Reed did something to that house," she said. "Something that can't be undone. The watchers are bound to it, and to anyone who lives there." Armed with this new information, I returned home, my mind racing. The journal's cryptic instructions made a little more sense now. Samuel Reed had tried to control the watchers, to use their power for his own gain. But he had failed, and in doing so, he had bound them to the house, and to anyone foolish enough to live there. I spent the rest of the day researching rituals and symbols, cross-referencing the journal's contents with anything I could find online. Most of it was useless, a mishmash of folklore and superstition, but one thing stood out, the idea of a vessel. In many occult traditions, a vessel was a person or object used to contain a spirit or entity. The journal's mention of a chosen vessel sent a chill down my spine. Was I the vessel? Or was it something, or someone else? That night, the house was more oppressive than ever. The creaks and groans of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate, as if the house itself were alive. Shadows danced on the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the flickering of the light bulbs. I sat in the living room, clutching the journal and a flashlight, too afraid to sleep. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, each second dragging on like an eternity. And then, just after midnight, the noises began. At first, it was the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze, my grip tightening on the flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until it sounded like someone, or something, was stomping through the hallway above me. I stood, my legs shaking, and aimed the flashlight toward the staircase. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. And then, slowly, deliberately, the footsteps resumed, this time coming down the stairs. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of the flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it at the staircase. A shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, its form vaguely human but distorted, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking. The figure paused, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. And then, in a voice that was both guttural and eerily familiar, it spoke. "The bond is broken. The vessel must be claimed." Before I could react, the shadow lunged toward me, moving impossibly fast. I screamed, throwing the flashlight at it in a desperate attempt to defend myself. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the living room floor, the faint glow of the symbols around me pulsing softly. The shadow was gone, but its words echoed in my mind. The bond was broken, and the vessel, whatever that meant, was still in play. I had less than 2 nights to figure out what to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Every corner of the house felt like it held a hidden eye, every creak of the floorboards like a quiet step closer. But I didn't have time to be afraid. I had to act. The third moonrise was looming, and the words from the journal were burned into my mind. The vessel must be claimed. What did that mean? Was I the vessel, or was something else intended for that role? I needed to find answers, and quickly. I spent the next day in a blur of research and frantic questioning. I had no idea where to even begin, but I knew that I had to find a way to stop whatever Samuel Reed had started. My brain kept going back to the symbol that had appeared in the journal, those runes. They had been faint but still visible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were more than just a random pattern. I found myself at the town library, sifting through books on occult practices, rituals, and ancient symbols. The musty smell of old paper surrounded me as I flipped through countless pages. Nothing seemed to fit, until I found it. In the margins of an ancient text, there was a description of a ritual similar to what Samuel Reed had likely performed. The ritual involved binding a spirit or entity to a person, or in some cases an object, making them the vessel for the spirit. The only way to break the bond was to destroy the vessel, severing the connection permanently. I ran my finger over the words, my heart pounding in my chest. Could it be that simple? Could I destroy the vessel, and destroy whatever was haunting me in the process? I returned home late that afternoon, exhausted but determined. The house was colder than it had been in days, the temperature dropping rapidly despite the warmth of the day. As I made my way inside, I felt a sharp chill down my spine. Something was wrong. It didn't take long to realize that the house wasn't just cold, it was suffocatingly still. There were no creaks in the floorboards, no whispering winds through the cracks in the windows. Everything was dead silent. I stood in the hallway, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I was feeling. And then I heard it. The faintest of whispers, barely audible, like the rustling of paper in the wind. It came from upstairs, right from the attic. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run far away from this place. But my feet were rooted to the floor, my body unwilling to move. The whispers grew louder, and then I heard a thump, followed by another and another, until it was a rhythmic pounding, as if something were trying to break free from the attic. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest flashlight and headed toward the stairs. The pulse of my heartbeat seemed to match the pounding coming from above. Each step creaked under my weight as I climbed the stairs. The closer I got to the attic door, the colder the air became. It felt like I was walking through a tunnel of ice, my skin prickling as if I were being watched by something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The pounding had stopped, but the air was thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly as if protesting my intrusion. The attic was dark, save for a small sliver of light coming through a crack in the roof. The floor was covered with old furniture, boxes, and clutter, but there was something else. A shape, something moving in the far corner. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. Then I saw it. A figure hunched over, its back to me. The faint light revealed the outline of something, or someone, sitting motionless in the corner. My heart leaped into my throat. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its cold, unnatural energy radiating toward me. "Who are you?" I repeated, louder this time. The figure stirred, and then slowly, agonizingly, it turned around. The face that looked at me was not human, at least not anymore. It was a twisted mockery of the man in the photograph, the man who had once been Samuel Reed. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his skull, his eyes sunken and hollow. But what terrified me most was the smile, an unsettling grin that seemed to stretch far too wide for a human face. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "The vessel has been chosen. The time has come." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure's eyes never left me as I turned and bolted from the attic. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door, where I collapsed on the floor, my hands shaking uncontrollably. What had I just seen? Was it really Samuel Reed, or had something else taken his place? I couldn't think straight. The weight of what was happening pressed down on me like 1,000 pounds. The vessel had been chosen. The bond was breaking. But the question remained, could I stop it? I didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing, the house wasn't just haunted. It was alive in a way that no one could fully understand. And it was coming for me. The terror in the attic had left me shaken, but it also sparked something within me. I couldn't just sit there helpless. The whispers, the figure, everything, it had all led me to this moment. I was being dragged deeper into this nightmare whether I liked it or not, but I wasn't going to let it consume me. Not without a fight. The air in the house felt thick now, heavy with the weight of something ancient. It wasn't just the temperature that had dropped, it was the very essence of the place, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Samuel Reed had started, it was nearing its completion. I spent the next few hours pacing, trying to gather my thoughts. I needed to go back into the attic. I had to face whatever it was that had taken root there. If Samuel Reed was truly still present in some form, I needed to understand it. I had to know how to stop it. But I also had to prepare myself. I couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. I began searching the house, looking for anything at all, that might give me an edge. In the basement, I found a collection of old, dusty tools, some of which I recognized as items used in rituals. Candles, salt, strange symbols painted on the walls. The same symbols from the journal. They seemed so out of place, yet they somehow made sense in this warped reality I was trapped in. I grabbed a few items and made my way back upstairs. The hallway was unnaturally quiet, but the silence was oppressive, like it was waiting for something to break it. My hand hovered over the door to the attic, but I hesitated. Something told me that once I crossed that threshold again, I would never be the same. But there was no turning back now. I opened the door and stepped into the attic. The stale air hit me like a wave, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift in the corners of my vision. I braced myself, shining the flashlight around the room. The space was empty, but I knew better than to think that meant I was safe. The feeling of being watched, that constant pressure against my chest, was still there. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from behind one of the old trunks in the corner. I didn't need to look twice to know that I wasn't alone. My heart raced, my breath catching in my throat as I took a cautious step forward. The whispering grew louder, but it was no longer in words. It was a sound, a feeling, something that resonated deep in my bones. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The figure appeared again, but this time, it wasn't hunched over. It stood upright, its pale face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. The empty eyes seemed to pierce straight through me, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing in from all sides. "You've come to finish it," it rasped, the voice unrecognizable, layered with the sounds of something ancient and malevolent. I raised the salt and candles, whispering the words I'd read in the journal. Rituals meant to break the bond, to sever the connection between this entity and the house. My hands trembled, but I had no choice. I had to do this. The entity seemed to recoil, a hiss slipping from its throat, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it grew stronger, more solid, its form shifting between Samuel Reed's twisted visage and something darker, something more monstrous. The room seemed to close in around me. The walls pressed together as if they were closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of this curse. And then it spoke again, its voice now a thunderous growl. "You cannot escape," it snarled. "You are the vessel now." The air crackled with an otherworldly energy as the figure lunged toward me, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. My heart pounded in my chest, and everything within me screamed to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't let this thing win. I threw the salt into the air, watching as it shimmered in the light of the candles, creating a barrier between us. For a moment, the figure hesitated, its form flickering as if it were being held back by some invisible force. I took my chance, grabbing a nearby piece of wood, a broken beam, and wielding it like a weapon. With everything I had left, I charged at the figure, swinging the beam with all my might. The impact made the house shake, the walls groaning in protest as the figure let out an ear-piercing scream. But it didn't vanish. It didn't die. Instead, it laughed, a low, mocking sound that filled the room and sent a chill through my entire body. "You think you can destroy me?" it hissed. "You can't even destroy yourself." I could feel it then, something cold, something sharp like ice running through my veins. The beam dropped from my hands and I fell to my knees, gasping for air as the world around me spun. The figure stepped closer and I realized with a sinking heart that it wasn't going to let me go. Not without taking me with it. The lights flickered above me, the candles sputtering out, leaving me in total darkness. But then something changed. A sudden violent wind burst through the attic, knocking everything over, sending books, furniture, and debris flying through the air. The figure shrieked as if caught in a violent storm, and in that moment I felt something break. Some invisible force that had been holding me captive for so long. The air cleared, the cold receded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the oppressive weight on my chest lifted. The figure was gone. But I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel free. I ran, faster than I ever had in my life, through the house and out into the night. The wind howled around me as I stumbled toward the gate, my legs weak, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I never looked back as I left the house behind, but I could still feel its pull, that dark presence lingering in the air, waiting for someone else to step into its grip. And as I stood there on the street in the cold night air, I heard it, faint at first like a whisper and then growing louder, until it was unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of footsteps following me into the night. The cold air bit at my skin as I stood frozen, my breath visible in the night. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic, wild beat that echoed in my ears. The footsteps. They were too close, too deliberate to be just my imagination. I had barely taken a step forward when I heard them again, heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. I spun around, expecting to see the house still standing behind me, but it was gone. Not literally gone, of course. The house was still there, sitting across the street as it had been, but it looked different now. The windows, once dark, now glowed faintly with an eerie light, and the door that had once been firmly closed seemed ajar, just enough to hint at something lurking beyond. I could feel it deep in my bones. The house was calling me, pulling me back into its dark embrace, as though the very ground beneath my feet was conspiring to return me to its clutches. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't. I broke into a run, my legs moving on their own as if they understood the danger far better than my rational mind. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my pace until it was all I could hear. The weight of them was crushing, like a heavy hand pressing down on my back, urging me to stop. But I kept running, my body trembling from fear and exhaustion. My lungs burned with each breath, and the world around me seemed to blur, the familiar streetlights casting strange shadows as I sprinted past them. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know how far I had run until I stumbled and nearly fell into a ditch at the edge of town. I stopped, hands on my knees, gasping for air. I felt sick, disoriented, as though the ground beneath me was shifting. And that's when I heard it again, the footsteps. I whirled around, panic rising in my chest, but there was no one there. Nothing but the dark stretch of the road, the empty houses, and the cold wind whipping through the trees. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling. They were there, just out of sight. Watching. Waiting. I forced myself to stand upright, wiping my damp palms on my jeans, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps had stopped, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. The house, the thing in the house, was still out there in the dark, and it had been following me. I walked slowly, cautiously, away from the edge of town, my senses heightened, every crack in the earth, every rustle of leaves, sending my heart into overdrive. The last thing I wanted was to be out in the open, but there was nowhere left to run. The house was behind me, but I knew it wasn't done with me. I tried to focus. I tried to remember everything I'd learned from the journal, the rituals, the signs that had been hidden in plain sight. If Samuel Reed had truly opened some kind of door, some kind of rift, then maybe it hadn't fully closed. Maybe the entity that had haunted me wasn't done, wasn't finished with its purpose yet. I had to figure out what that purpose was. I had to find a way to stop it once and for all. I couldn't stay out here forever, though. I had to go back to the house. But how could I face it again? How could I face what had happened in that attic? The figure, the whispers, the feeling of something closing in on me. I started walking again, slowly this time, keeping my senses sharp. I needed to gather my thoughts, find somewhere to regroup. I reached a small cafe on the outskirts of town, one I had passed a few times before but never stopped at. The lights inside were dim, but it felt like a safe place. A place where I could think without feeling like I was being watched. I entered, the bell above the door jingling softly as I stepped inside. The cafe was nearly empty, save for one person sitting at the counter, sipping a coffee. The place smelled of fresh pastries and strong coffee, a comfort I didn't know I needed until that moment. I walked up to the counter, my hands trembling as I tried to force a smile at the barista behind it. She didn't seem to notice my unease, just nodded and asked if I wanted anything to drink. I ordered a coffee, anything to settle my nerves. As I waited, I glanced around the room trying to steady myself. That's when I saw the newspaper clipping on the corkboard above the counter. The headline read, "Local family disappears, no trace found." I felt my heart stop in my chest as I leaned in to read the article, my blood turning cold. The family had lived in the very house I had just fled from. And the article wasn't just about a missing family, it was about a curse. They had vanished without a trace. the neighbors reporting strange noises coming from the house for weeks before the disappearance. The last entry in the article read, "Some say the house has claimed many over the years, that it hungers for more." The last family's youngest child was seen running from the house, babbling incoherently about the dark and the door. No one ever found them. I felt the world spin beneath me. The door. That had to be it. That was the key, the door that Samuel Reed had opened. Whatever was behind it was still hunting, and I was its next target. The barista set the coffee in front of me, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, my pulse quickening as the reality of the situation hit me. I needed to go back. I needed to find the door and close it before whatever was stalking me found a way to cross over. But first I had to finish what I had started. I stood abruptly, leaving a tip on the counter before hurrying out of the cafe. The footsteps were back. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a chill that cut straight through my coat, but I hardly noticed it. My mind was consumed with one singular thought. I had to go back. The house. The door. I couldn't let whatever haunted it get to me. I retraced my steps through the town, past the street lights that seemed to flicker like the last moments of a dying candle. The house stood ahead, a looming shadow in the distance. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting my return. As I approached the front gate, I hesitated, a tremor running through me. It was as if the house was aware of my presence, watching me with eyes that didn't belong. The windows that had once been dark were now glowing faintly, casting an unnatural light into the yard. The door, slightly ajar when I'd left, was now wide open, inviting me in like a predator lying in wait. I stood at the gate for a long time, debating whether I should turn around and run. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The knowledge I had gained from the journal, Samuel Reed's twisted obsession with the occult, the rituals he had performed, the door he had opened, was far too dangerous to ignore. I had to face it. I walked up the creaky path, my footsteps eerily quiet against the rustling leaves. When I reached the door, I took a deep breath, steeling myself before stepping over the threshold. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something darker. A presence lingered in the rooms, like a weight pressing down on everything. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, sending my heart into a panic. I turned quickly, my pulse hammering in my throat, but it was only the wind. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing. The house was silent. Too silent. I moved cautiously through the hallway, my eyes scanning every corner, every dark space. The air seemed to shimmer with a faint static, as though something unseen was moving just beyond my sight. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. I climbed the stairs, each creak of the old wood beneath my feet sounding louder than the last, echoing in the stillness of the house. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my eyes drawn to the attic door at the far end of the hall. The door was cracked open, a thin sliver of darkness beckoning me. I could feel it now, the pull, the pressure, like the house itself was drawing me toward it, as if I was meant to open it. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I pushed the door fully open. The attic was just as I remembered it, cold, dank, with shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I shivered, fighting the overwhelming urge to run. And then I saw it. The door. It stood at the far end of the attic, barely visible in the dim light. The door Samuel Reed had used in his twisted rituals, the one that had opened into something far worse than anyone should have known. I approached it slowly, the air growing colder with each step. My hand reached out, brushing against the old wood, and I felt a shock of cold shoot through my fingertips. I recoiled, but the door seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, urging me forward. I wanted to scream, to run far away from this cursed place, but my body refused to obey. I had to know. I had to see what was on the other side. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. It turned with a reluctant creak, as though the door didn't want to open, but I forced it. The door opened with an agonizing groan, revealing darkness beyond, an endless void that seemed to stretch into nothing. I stared into it, feeling my stomach churn with a mixture of dread and curiosity. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, something waiting, watching just beyond the threshold. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath against the back of my neck. My blood ran cold as I whipped around, expecting to find someone standing there, but no one was. The air itself seemed to be alive, pressing in on me, choking me. The house was alive. The door was alive. It was too much. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body acted before my mind could process the fear. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor as the room seemed to close in on me. Then the voice came. It was low, guttural, and filled with malice, like something scraping against my bones. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, sending a chill through my spine. "You should have stayed away." I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch, paralyzed with fear, as the shadows in the room began to twist, taking form, shifting into something I couldn't comprehend. The thing was close now. I could feel it beside me, its presence suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. It whispered again, its voice clearer this time, like it was speaking directly into my mind. "Now you belong to me." The floor beneath me trembled, and I could feel the air grow thick with a palpable, suffocating darkness. The entity was closing in, its cold touch creeping along my skin, and in that moment I realized it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was me. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and bolted for the stairs. But the house seemed to fight me, the walls closing in, the floorboard shifting under my feet. The door at the bottom of the stairs slammed shut, as though the house itself was trying to trap me. I pushed against the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the wood, screaming, begging, praying for someone to hear me. But no one could. I was trapped. The house had me. The darkness closed in around me, and as I stood there, helpless, I heard the whispers again, echoing in my mind. The door hadn't been the only thing Samuel Reed had opened. He had opened something far worse, something that had never left. And it wasn't done with me. The front door of the house remained open when the next tenants arrived, the wind carrying with it the same cold whispers, the same weight of dread. The house, it seemed, was always waiting for the next one, the next soul to walk through its door. Story 2. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the old house was the smell. It wasn't anything too out of the ordinary for a place that hadn't been lived in for a while, dusty, musty air that clung to everything. But there was something else beneath it, something faint, like wet earth or old wood, a scent that seemed to seep from the floorboards themselves. It wasn't long after my divorce that I decided to leave the city behind. The hustle, the noise, it all felt too suffocating, too tied to memories I was trying to forget. So when I saw this house for rent in the small town of Whistling Pines, something about it called to me. The rent was cheap, and the landlord was eager to get rid of it. I could see why. The house was a relic, one of those places where the walls seemed to sigh and groan with age. But it was mine now, and that was enough. I spent the first few days unpacking, getting used to the creaks and groans of the old structure. The hardwood floors, stained by time, shifted under my feet as if the house itself was settling in for the night. The stairs had a habit of squeaking no matter how carefully I tried to step on them, and the doors never quite closed right, always leaving a slight gap. But it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. It was just an old house, nothing more, nothing less. The neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, was the first person to speak to me. She seemed nice enough, though her gaze lingered a little too long on the house as we chatted by the fence. Her thin lips curled into a smile, but her eyes were distant, almost troubled. "You've moved into the old Whitmore place, haven't you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. I nodded. "That's right. Seems like a nice spot." Mrs. Caldwell didn't immediately respond. Instead, she glanced back at the house, her expression shifting, darkening just a little. "Well," she started slowly, as if carefully choosing her words, "you might want to keep your wits about you. Folks say strange things happen there. I've heard it's been, well, cursed, I guess." I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether she was joking or serious. "Oh, I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice softening. "It's just a house. But trust me, I've lived here long enough to know the rumors. The Whitmores weren't exactly the friendly sort. Strange things used to happen. One tenant even ran out in the middle of the night, babbling about footsteps and whispers. People say the house has a history, and not a good one." I smiled awkwardly, trying to brush it off. "I'm sure it's just the usual small-town gossip, right?" Mrs. Caldwell didn't seem convinced. "Just be careful," she said, turning away. "The house remembers." That night, I tried not to think about her words, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed to have a life of its own. It wasn't just the old wood or the way the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. It was something deeper, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone in that place. The first strange occurrence happened a few nights later. I was in bed, trying to settle into a comfortable position, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans. But these footsteps were different. They were too distinct, too deliberate, like someone was walking just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, echoing through the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a mouse. It was something human. I stood up and walked cautiously to the door, my hand trembling on the handle. There was nothing outside. Just the dark, empty hallway stretching before me. No footsteps, no movement. I checked the windows, locked. The house was as still as it had been when I first moved in. The next day I tried to brush it off. The house was old after all. Old houses made noises. I even convinced myself that I had imagined the footsteps, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days went by, the odd occurrences only grew more frequent. I would hear soft whispers in the walls, just out of earshot, like someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Sometimes the air in the house would grow inexplicably cold, sending a shiver down my spine even though the heat was on. And every night, the footsteps would return. Always at the same time, always just outside my door. I began to wonder if Mrs. Caldwell had been right. Maybe there was something to the rumors after all. It wasn't until I found the journal that I began to uncover the house's dark past. I'd been cleaning out the attic one afternoon when I stumbled across an old leather-bound book, buried beneath a pile of forgotten belongings. It was a journal, its pages yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The entries inside were disturbing, filled with accounts of rituals, strange occurrences, and growing madness. The journal belonged to Thomas Whitmore, the house's original owner. As I flipped through its pages, I learned that he had been obsessed with the occult, delving into forbidden knowledge in search of power. He performed rituals, dark ones, in the very rooms I now slept in. According to the journal, Thomas believed that he had opened a door, a gateway to something otherworldly, something that had been lurking just beyond the veil of reality. I read about his growing paranoia, his belief that the house itself was alive, that it had a consciousness of its own. And then, towards the end, the entries became erratic, frantic. Thomas wrote about hearing voices, about shadows that moved on their own, about the house whispering to him in the dead of night. The final entry, written in a trembling hand, sent a chill through my entire body. It is coming. I can feel it. It waits in the dark corners of the house. It speaks to me, beckons me to join it. I closed the journal and set it aside, my hands shaking. The footsteps, the cold air, the whispers. It all made sense now. The house wasn't just creaking. It was alive, haunted by whatever Thomas Whitmore had unleashed all those years ago. That night, I sat in my bedroom trying to steady my breath. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. But just as I was about to gather my things, the footsteps began again. This time they were louder, closer. And then they stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. My name. I froze, my blood running cold. The air in the room grew frigid and I could feel someone, standing behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see nothing. But there, sitting at the foot of my bed, was a shadow darker than the rest of the room, its shape twisted and unnatural. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe. The shadow stretched towards me, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. I screamed and ran, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. I didn't look back as I fled into the night. I never returned to the house. I couldn't bring myself to. But even now as I lie in bed, I hear the whispers, the footsteps, the cold. They haunt me, follow me wherever I go. And I know that whatever Thomas Whitmore unleashed in that house, it still waits. It's still there. And it's only a matter of time before it finds its next victim. Maybe it's you. I didn't sleep much that night. The fear was too raw, too fresh. My body was still buzzing from the terror of what I had felt, the cold fingers, the whisper of my name that echoed in my mind long after I had fled the house. It followed me everywhere, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I ran. The next morning, I found myself standing at the foot of my new doorstep, unsure of what to do. The idea of going back to the house, of facing whatever I had left behind, was unbearable. But something inside me, a mixture of stubbornness and curiosity, urged me to return. I needed answers. I needed to know what had really happened in that house, why it felt alive, why it was so determined to pull me back into its grasp. But first, I had to face the reality of living in this town. Whistling Pines was quiet, too quiet sometimes, with only a handful of people to make up the whole community. Most of them were older folks, content to keep to themselves and stick to their routines. Mrs. Caldwell had been the only one who spoke to me, but even she seemed to carry an air of mystery, as if she knew more about the house than she let on. I decided to take a walk into town to clear my head and try to forget about the events of the night before. I walked past rows of small houses, the streets lined with trees that whispered in the breeze. It was peaceful here, peaceful enough that I could almost convince myself that nothing had happened, that everything was fine. I stopped by the small convenience store, a tiny rundown building with faded signs and a bell that jingled as I walked in. The shopkeeper, a man named Greg, looked up from behind the counter as I entered. He was middle-aged, with a weathered face and deep-set eyes that always seemed to be watching, observing. He greeted me with a nod. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You're the one in the old Whitmore place, right?" I froze. It was as if everyone in this town knew. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure. "That's right," I replied, my voice shaky. It's a nice place." Greg's gaze didn't leave me, and for a moment, I felt like he was studying me, like he could see right through me. "Nice? That's one way to put it," he muttered under his breath. "You know about the Whitmores, don't you?" I forced myself to meet his eyes. "I've heard a few things," I said, trying to sound casual, like the rumors didn't bother me. Greg's expression hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Things around here, they don't change easily. People come and go, but the house always remembers. It's like it feeds off of the fear, the pain. We'll see." Eventually, I felt a chill run down my spine. His words sounded like an omen, but I didn't know how to respond. He clearly wasn't just talking about the house's age or its structure. There was something deeper, something unsettling in his tone. It made me wonder if there was more to this town than I'd realized. "I'll be fine," I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I had hoped. Greg didn't seem convinced. He simply nodded, his gaze still lingering on me as if he were waiting for something. "Sure you will," he said, and I couldn't tell if he meant it or if he was warning me. I left the store with my mind buzzing. It wasn't the first time I had heard rumors about the house, but hearing it from Greg, someone who seemed to know more about the town's history than anyone else, made me uneasy. I had a feeling that I wasn't going to be able to outrun the past, no matter how far I tried to distance myself from it. When I got home, I stood outside the house for a long time, staring at the front door, wondering if I should even go inside. Every instinct in me told me to leave, to turn my back on this place and never look back. But the thought of running away, of letting whatever haunted that house win, didn't sit right with me. I couldn't just walk away. I had to know what had really happened here. With a deep breath, I walked up the creaky steps and into the house. As soon as I stepped inside, the air grew colder, like something was waiting for me. I could feel the house's presence again, its heavy silence pressing in on me from all sides. The house hadn't changed. The walls still groaned and whispered. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, as if they were reaching for me, but I couldn't stop now. I needed to dig deeper. I made my way back to the attic. The journal, the one that had revealed so much about Thomas Whitmore's madness, still lay there on the floor where I had left it. I picked it up again, feeling its weight in my hands, the leather binding stiff and cracked with age. I had barely begun to read when I heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing outside the attic door. I set the journal aside and moved toward the stairs, but before I could reach the door, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart raced as I turned around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the emptiness of the attic, the dust-covered beams overhead, and the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I was about to open the door when the whispering began. It was faint at first, like a murmur just out of hearing range, but then it grew louder. It was like a voice that wasn't quite human, slithering through the air, a chorus of hushed tones calling my name. "Get out." The words were soft, insistent, like a command I couldn't ignore. I stood frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Leave?" And then the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving in the hallway. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran down the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground, my pulse thundering in my ears. But when I reached the bottom, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in the doorway of the living room, was a figure. A silhouette, tall and dark, its shape shifting unnaturally in the dim light. I could see nothing of its face, only a blackened, formless void. The figure stepped forward, its cold, hollow presence closing in on me. I turned to run, but the floorboards creaked underfoot, the weight of something pressing down on me from all sides, holding me in place. The whispers grew louder, the air colder, until the house itself seemed to scream in agony. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the fear that had gripped me. I had made a terrible mistake. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on something deep inside me, something I couldn't escape. And I knew deep down that whatever was in this house wouldn't let me leave without a fight. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when the terror began to recede, I could barely make sense of what had just happened. The figure, the thing in the doorway, it was gone. I wasn't sure if it had been real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore it. Something in that house had stirred, something dark, something ancient, and it wasn't done with me yet. I stumbled toward the front door, desperate to escape, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden, sharp coldness grip my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around quickly, but nothing had changed. The house was just as it had been, dark and silent. Yet I could still feel it, something watching, waiting. The air felt heavier, suffocating. It pressed in on me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. I took a shaky step backward, away from the door, and the coldness lifted just slightly, enough for me to breathe again. The quiet that followed was almost worse than the noise. The silence was thick with unseen eyes. I had to get out of this house. I had to leave and never come back. But as I turned to run for the back door, my foot caught on something, sending me crashing to the floor. I gritted my teeth against the pain and looked down, only to find a small object lying in the corner of the room. It was a tiny, blackened box, no bigger than a shoebox. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. It wasn't something I had noticed before. Had it always been there? I hadn't seen it when I first moved in. Against every instinct I had, I found myself reaching for it. My fingers brushed against the smooth surface, and a jolt of ice shot through my hand. It felt like I was holding on to something alive, something with a pulse, a heartbeat of its own. The moment I touched it, I heard a whisper. This time it wasn't a voice in my head. It came from the box, soft and murmuring. "Open it." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was so faint, so quiet, like a breath on the back of my neck. I dropped the box like it was on fire, stumbling backward as if I had just touched something poisonous. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, the floor creaking beneath my weight. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to leave the house. But as I moved toward the back door again, the whisper came once more, louder this time. "Leave, leave, but you won't escape." I stopped in my tracks, my body stiff and trembling. I knew this voice. It was the same one from the night before, the same whisper that had followed me through the halls. My thoughts raced. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. I had to focus. I had to get out of this house, but my legs wouldn't move. And then, as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, slow and measured just like before. I spun around, but this time I wasn't alone. The figure was back. It had come from nowhere, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the room. It moved toward me, silent and menacing, its shape ever shifting, as if it was made of darkness itself. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. My body refused to listen. "Leave," the whisper came again, this time in a low, growling voice that seemed to come from the very walls. "You cannot leave. You are mine." The figure loomed closer, its shape warping as it advanced. I could feel its presence, suffocating and cold, the air around it growing frigid, like ice crawling through my veins. A sense of dread washed over me, so intense I could taste it, thick and bitter in my mouth. "Please," I gasped, my voice trembling. "Please, just let me go." But the figure didn't answer. It simply advanced, its movements growing quicker, more purposeful. I could feel it now, pressing down on me, closing in around me, the darkness choking the life out of the room. And then, in an instant, the figure stopped. The coldness receded, and for a split second, the house was still. I dared to breathe, my body aching with the strain of holding my breath for so long. But the silence didn't last. The figure whispered once more, its voice like a hiss in my ear. "You think you can leave? You think you can escape me?" I closed my eyes, desperate to block out the sound, but the whisper only grew louder. And then, a heavy weight pressed down on the bed, the same bed where I had tried to sleep the night before. Something, or someone, was sitting there beside me, the mattress sinking under its weight. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed by fear, as I felt the cold fingers brush against my arm, the unmistakable presence of something watching me. I finally forced my eyes open, and the sight that met me made my heart stop. The figure was no longer in the room. Instead, there was a shadow standing by the bed, its shape clearer now, darker than the surrounding darkness, almost solid. It didn't have a face, no eyes, no mouth, just a void, a black hole where a person should be. I could feel it. I could feel its gaze, even though it didn't have a face to stare back at me. It leaned in closer, and the air grew so cold, so thick I could barely breathe. I felt its cold breath against my ear, the words coming from it like a whisper that cut through me. "You can't leave." The weight on the bed grew heavier, and then, nothing. The coldness vanished. The whisper stopped. The figure was gone. But I wasn't alone. I didn't know how long I sat there, trembling in the darkness of that room. I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. I couldn't trust anything I had seen, heard, or felt. All I knew was that something in that house was alive, and it was waiting for me. It's been days since that night, but I can still feel it, the lingering presence that refuses to let me go. I can't tell anyone. How could I? Who would believe me? No one even knows what's been happening here. The house, the strange events, the whispers. It's all in my head, right? That's what I keep telling myself, trying to cling to some semblance of sanity. I tried leaving. I really did. I packed my things, put on my shoes, and stood at the front door. But I couldn't do it. The moment my hand touched the knob, the house seemed to groan, like it was protesting. A shiver ran through me and I froze, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The door wouldn't open. I tugged harder, pulling with all my strength, but it was as if the house had a hold on me, a grip I couldn't shake. The walls pressed in, the air grew thick, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath my feet. I could almost hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like they were coming from the walls themselves. It was as if the house knew what I was planning, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. After what felt like an eternity, I backed away from the door, my breath shallow and quick. I couldn't leave. I wasn't allowed to leave, and the house knew it. I collapsed onto the couch, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something that could explain what was happening to me. The silence in the house felt heavier now, like it was alive, watching me, waiting. I felt as though every shadow in the corner was alive, every creak in the floor was a warning, every gust of wind a whisper of something far darker than I could comprehend. I wanted to scream, to break free from this madness, but I knew that would only draw attention to me, whatever was watching, whatever was lurking in the shadows. That's when I remembered the box. I hadn't thought about it much since the night I dropped it. I had tried to push the memory away, telling myself that it was just a strange object, nothing more. But now, as I sat in the oppressive silence of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to all of this. I hesitated, my heart racing, but the pull was undeniable. I had to know what was inside that box. I had to understand what it wanted from me. I got up slowly, my legs trembling with each step. I made my way back to the spot where I had dropped the box, the coldness of the floor creeping up my spine as I knelt down to pick it up. It was still there, in the same place I had left it, as though it had never moved. My hands shook as I reached for it again, the surface cool and smooth under my fingers. This time I didn't drop it. I held it steady, my breath shallow as I examined the box. There were no markings, no labels, nothing to indicate what it was or where it came from. It looked like a simple, unremarkable box. But I knew better. I had to open it. With a shaky breath, I pried the lid open. The moment my fingers lifted it, the temperature in the room dropped. The air turned to ice and a deep sense of dread settled over me. Inside the box there was nothing at first, just blackness. But then I saw it, a small yellowed piece of paper folded neatly inside. I reached for it, my pulse pounding in my ears. As soon as my fingers brushed the paper, I heard it again, the whisper. Low, guttural, like a voice from the depths of the earth. Read it? I didn't want to. My body screamed at me to stop, to throw the box away and run out of the house. But I couldn't. The whisper was too strong. It was pulling me and guiding me. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a journal entry. The handwriting was scrawled in jagged, hurried strokes, almost illegible. But I could make out enough to know that it was from the house's original owner, the one who had lived here before me. Her name was Eliza. The journal entry was dated almost 100 years ago, but the words still felt fresh, as if they had been written just yesterday. April 17, 1923. I can feel it now. It's closer than ever before, waiting just beyond the door. I've opened the portal, made contact with something far older than this house, older than anything I've ever known. It speaks to me in whispers, promises of power, of knowledge, of things that should not be known. But it demands a price. And I fear I'm too far gone to turn back. The others, they don't understand. They can't see what I've seen. The shadows are everywhere now, moving on their own, whispering in my ears at night. I hear their footsteps too, the ones that follow me from room to room. I can't escape them. They won't let me in. I think I've made a mistake. But it's too late. There's no turning back now. I'm bound to them. They've marked me. The entry ended abruptly, as if Eliza had been interrupted, or worse, pulled away. I set the journal down, my hands still trembling. Eliza's words echoed in my mind. She had opened a portal. Something ancient, something evil. The shadows, the whispers, the footsteps, they weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real. and they had been here long before I arrived. I felt sick to my stomach. What had I gotten myself into? What was I supposed to do now? Suddenly, the house creaked, a loud groan coming from somewhere deep within the walls. The temperature dropped again, and I could hear the soft sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. They were back. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to understand. All I knew was that the house had me now, and there was no escape. I barely slept that night. I could still hear the footsteps echoing through the house, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth just out of sight. Every creak of the floorboard, every gust of wind that rattled the windows felt like a warning. The walls were closing in around me, and I couldn't tell if the air was growing colder or if I was just losing my mind. The journal entry was still on my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Eliza had opened something, some kind of door to another world or dimension, and now it was after me. But what could I do? How could I fight something I didn't understand? How could I even begin to grasp the horrors that she had unleashed? I decided to go to the local library, desperate to find something that could explain what had happened to Eliza and what was happening to me. The house's curse, the whispers, the footsteps, all of it felt like it was spiraling out of control, and I needed answers before I lost what little grip I had left on reality. I wrapped myself in my coat, even though the day was warm, the chill in my bones impossible to shake. The walk to the library felt longer than usual, as though something invisible was following me, urging me to turn around, to go back. I ignored the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. The library was a small, quiet place, tucked between a cafe and an antique store on the main street. It had an old, musty smell, the kind of place that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. I knew I wouldn't find much there. This wasn't the kind of town that had records of ancient curses or occult rituals, but I had to try. I found the librarian, an older woman with thin, gray hair and glasses perched on the end of her nose. She gave me a curious look when I asked if she had any information on the history of the house I was renting. But when I mentioned the name Eliza, her face went pale. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low. "You're living there?" she asked, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Yes, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know much about it when I moved in. But now, there's something wrong with the house. It's haunted. She didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she nodded slowly. "There are stories," she said quietly. "Old ones. About Eliza and what she did. She was obsessed with the occult. Rumors say she opened something that shouldn't have been opened. People say she invited things in, things that weren't human. Like ghosts?" I asked, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "More than ghosts," the librarian replied. "Spirits, entities, things from beyond. She believed she could control them, but they took control of her. And after she died, the house was never the same. People who lived there before you, they left, some in a hurry. One of them ran out in the middle of the night, screaming. Others talked about hearing things. Footsteps. Voices. I felt a chill creep up my spine. So, it wasn't just me. Others had heard it too. Do you have any records? Any books that might explain more about her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The librarian hesitated, then nodded. "We have a few old books in the back, but they're not easy to find. Come with me." I followed her to a dusty, forgotten corner of the library where old tomes lined the shelves, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. She pulled down a thick leather-bound book and opened it to a section that was marked with a faded ribbon. "This is about the rituals Eliza was involved in," she explained. "It's part of a collection from an old local historian who investigated the house. There are mentions of other occult practices too. Some of the rituals were meant to summon spirits, others to open doors, places where things that don't belong here, can cross over." I took the book, my hands trembling. The words on the pages were dense, filled with strange symbols and cryptic instructions. But I managed to make out enough to understand that Eliza had performed a ritual meant to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. She had used the house itself as a focal point, believing its location had some kind of supernatural significance. The book described ancient, forbidden rituals, ways to summon and communicate with spirits, ways to break the barriers between worlds. And it seemed Eliza had done exactly that. There was one passage toward the end of the chapter that caught my eye. Once the door is opened, it will never fully close. Those who open it will always feel its pull, a constant presence that will never leave. The house will become a vessel, a place for what has crossed over to remain. And as long as the house stands, so too will the doorway. I closed the book, feeling the weight of its words pressing down on me. Eliza had opened a door, one that could never be shut again. And now, the things she had called forth were here, trapped in this house with me. I wanted to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But the whispers, the footsteps, the chill in the air, they were always with me now. I couldn't escape. There was no escape. I thanked the librarian and left the library in a daze, my thoughts swirling. It wasn't just a haunted house. It was something far worse. Whatever had been summoned here was still here, and it was waiting. The sun had begun to set as I walked back to the house, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the street, following me. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to pull me down. When I finally reached the front door, I hesitated. I could feel it, the weight of the house's gaze upon me. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. The house was alive with something dark and ancient. The whispering started again, faint at first, then louder. Closer. It was coming from the hallway. I took a deep breath and moved toward it, my heart racing. The footsteps, heavy and deliberate, were close now, following me, taunting me. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that had been locked when I first arrived. My hand trembled as I gripped the handle. It was time to face whatever was waiting behind that door. And I knew deep down there would be no going back after this. The door creaked as I turned the handle, the sound sharp and agonizing, echoing through the empty hall like a warning. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the cracked wood, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on me, urging me to turn away. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave now, not when I was so close to understanding what was happening to me, what Eliza had done. I pushed the door open. A wave of cold air hit me, more intense than the usual drafts that haunted the house. It was like stepping into another world, one that had been sealed away for far too long. The room was small, barely furnished, and the walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper that seemed to have absorbed the years of secrets and sorrow. But it wasn't the room itself that made my skin crawl. It was the heavy, suffocating presence that lingered in the air, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for me to discover this place. I stepped inside, my feet sinking slightly into the old floorboards, which groaned under my weight. The air smelled stale, like something that hadn't been disturbed in decades. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, cracked surface of a small table near the far wall. On it, there was a faded candle holder, covered in dust and cobwebs. The candle was long gone, but the marks it had left on the wood were still visible. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I moved deeper into the room. The walls seemed to close in around me, the space growing tighter with every step. I was aware of every creak of the floor beneath me, every whisper of wind from the broken windows. But what unsettled me the most was the sense that I wasn't alone. Something was in here with me, watching. I turned slowly, scanning the room, my eyes landing on an old bookshelf against the far wall. The books were dusty and well-worn, their spines faded with age. My heart skipped a beat when I saw one book that stood out among the others. Its cover was plain, but there was something about it that drew me in. I walked toward it, my hand shaking as I reached out to grab it. The moment my fingers brushed against the cover, a sharp noise broke the silence, the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind me. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the dim shadows that danced in the corners of the room. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more suffocating. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Something about the book held me in place, its presence calling to me, pulling me deeper into the house's secrets. I picked it up. The pages were yellowed with age, brittle and fragile in my hands. The writing inside was cramped, barely legible, but it was unmistakable. Eliza's handwriting. I could almost hear her voice as I read the words, each sentence dripping with desperation, fear, and madness. Asterisk, the door is open. It cannot be closed. It watches us. It listens. It is everywhere and it is coming for us. There is no escape. Asterisk. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the chaotic scribbles. Some pages were filled with symbols I couldn't understand, while others seemed to describe rituals, ways to control what had crossed over, ways to communicate with it. But none of them seemed to work. The more Eliza tried to force control, the more the house, and whatever was in it, slipped further beyond her grasp. Asterisk, I hear it at night. It walks the halls. It whispers my name. It's growing stronger. I am losing myself. I cannot stop it. Asterisk. I slammed the book shut, the sound of it cutting through the air like a knife. My pulse was racing, my chest tight with fear. I looked around the room, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers had started again, low and guttural, like the sound of something crawling beneath the floorboards. It was coming from all around me, filling the space surrounding me. The walls seemed to press in, the air thick with something I couldn't name. The house was alive, breathing, and it was hungry. I backed away from the bookshelf, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to shift, moving closer, tightening around me. And then, there it was, a figure in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape indistinct in the dim light. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. Something dark, something wrong. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as if the room itself had become a vacuum, sucking the warmth from my body. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were frozen, my body paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. The darkness seemed to swirl around it, obscuring its form, and as it moved closer, I could hear the sound of breathing, deep, ragged, and unmistakably human. But it wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for me. I turned, bolting for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. My hand met the cold wood, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the figure was closing in on me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, all of them speaking at once, filling my mind with their demands. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. But the air was thick, heavy, suffocating. I could feel something sitting on my chest, pressing down, its cold breath on my neck. It was here. It had come for me. And in that moment, I knew I was never going to leave this house. The door crashed open behind me and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The house seemed to pulse with life around me, the walls groaning, the floorboards creaking, and the whispers, oh God, the whispers, were louder now, like a chorus of voices all clamoring for attention. I ran down the stairs, my feet slipping on the worn carpet, but the house was everywhere, closing in on me. I reached the front door, my hands trembling as I tried to unlock it. The door was shaking, the wood warping under the pressure of something pushing against it from the other side. I wrenched it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't matter. I was free. I had to be free. I ran. And I didn't stop running. But as I looked back, the house loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty, its door wide open as if inviting me back in. And in the distance, I could still hear the whispers. It wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, the house came rushing back, its cold, oppressive presence filling my mind. The whispers, the figure in the doorway, the touch on my shoulder, everything was so vivid, so real. I could still feel the weight of it pressing down on me, the suffocating grip of whatever had been haunting that house. I couldn't escape it. I spent the night sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. The streetlights outside flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the room. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The house was old, full of creaks and groans, and I had to admit I was probably imagining most of it, right? But then, around 3 a.m., the noises started again. At first, it was faint, a soft scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling, but then it grew louder, closer. The sound of something heavy moving in the darkness, its footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the panic rising in my chest. But then the floorboards outside my bedroom creaked. And it wasn't the wind. I could hear someone, or something, walking just outside the door, its footsteps dragging as if it was struggling to move. There was no mistaking it this time. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. I stood up, my legs shaking as I crept toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The thought of what might be waiting on the other side terrified me, but I had to know. I had to see. I slowly turned the knob and pulled the door open just a crack. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been earlier. The old wooden floor stretched out in both directions. The dim light from the street lamp outside casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and shift as I watched. There was no sign of movement, no sounds except for the occasional creak of the house settling. I exhaled a shaky breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me again. But then I heard it. A voice. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A whisper right behind me. You can't leave? I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat as the whisper continued, now coming from all directions, as if the house itself was speaking to me. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were pressing in on me. The house was alive in a way I couldn't understand. And then I remembered Eliza's journal. The rituals, the curse. The house had been built on something dark, something ancient. And now it was awake, alive again, and it wanted something from me. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that this was all in my head. I grabbed my things, throwing them into a suitcase with trembling hands, but I couldn't focus. I kept hearing the whispers, feeling the cold breath on my neck. The house was not going to let me go. As I made my way to the front door, I hesitated. The door was wide open. I had left it that way, but now it felt wrong. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever, as if the world itself was empty, consumed by whatever was inside this house. I stepped outside, the chill of the night air biting at my skin, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like I was walking into something far worse. I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the shadows of the trees, the silence of the night. I kept walking. And as I turned the corner, I heard the voice once more. Asterisk, you can never escape. Asterisk. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But deep down, I knew it was true. The house wasn't done with me yet. It wasn't finished. And no matter where I went, I would always feel its presence, waiting, watching. It was waiting for the next person to move in. And when they did, it would begin again. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. No matter how much I tried to tell myself that it was over, that I had escaped, something inside me knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. The whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Those things didn't just vanish because you left the building. They followed you, buried deep inside your mind. I stayed with a friend for a few days, hoping the distance would give me some peace. But the fear never left. At night, the darkness would close in on me, and I would hear the creaks of floorboards, feel the cold breath on my neck. Every shadow seemed to shift, and every gust of wind felt like a whisper just on the edge of my hearing. The only thing that kept me going was the thought that maybe, just maybe, if I stayed away long enough, I would forget. But no matter how many nights I spent in a safe, well-lit room, the images of that house, of those whispers, of that cold touch stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Eliza's journal. I needed to know more about the history of that house, about the rituals, about the curse. What had happened there? Why had it come for me? I tried to track down Eliza's relatives, but no one seemed to know anything about her, at least nothing that made sense. I tried searching online, digging through old records, but all I found were rumors and whispers, more mystery, more questions, and no answers. It was as if the house had erased her existence, like it had erased everything connected to it. I couldn't just let it go. It had to mean something. It was too much. Too many strange things had happened, and there was no way I could move on without understanding what had truly happened in that house. So I went back. I didn't know why I thought that would help, but I had to. I needed closure. I needed to know if there was a way to stop it, to end whatever had begun when I moved in. When I arrived at the house, I felt it the moment I stepped onto the property, this cold, suffocating feeling that I hadn't even been able to shake off during my time away. It was like stepping into the mouth of some dark, waiting creature, its jaws opening wide, ready to swallow me whole. The house loomed in front of me just as I remembered it, old, weathered, and eerily silent. The wind was still, the air thick, and the sky was a dull gray, like it was holding its breath. I stood there for a long time, staring at the house, my pulse quickening. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't leave until I found the answers I was searching for. I went inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I winced at the sound. I hadn't realized how much I had come to associate that sound with fear, with the things that lived in this house. But it was all still here. The house had not changed, and neither had the oppressive feeling that had haunted me since the first night. I walked through the rooms, looking for anything that could explain the curse, anything that could give me a reason to keep my sanity. But it was as if the house itself was resisting me, refusing to reveal its secrets. The more I searched, the more I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes following me from every corner, every shadow. Finally, I made my way to the basement. The door to it stood ajar, as if it had been waiting for me to come. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, but then the darkness below seemed to pull me in. My feet carried me forward without thought, step by step, as if something was urging me down. The basement smelled damp, musty. It was colder here, the air thick with the smell of earth and rot. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, as if the house itself was slowly sinking into the ground. And then I saw it. A door. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes. But it was there, and it was locked. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. Something about it felt wrong, like I had found the place where it all began. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the lock. And that's when I heard it, the voice. Soft at first, a whisper, then growing louder. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk. I froze. The voice wasn't in my head. It was real. I could hear it, feel it vibrating in my bones, the cold, malevolent energy it carried wrapping around me like a vice. I wanted to run. I should have run. But instead, I did something I would regret for the rest of my life. I opened the door. The moment I did, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could feel the chill seep into my skin, the darkness closing in on me from all sides. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. The walls were covered in symbols, strange, jagged markings that twisted and writhed as if they were alive. In the center of the room was an altar, old and covered in dust, with candles long burned out. But what really made my stomach turn was the thing on the altar. A figure. It was small, shriveled, and covered in a tangle of hair, but it was moving, twitching, breathing. And then, from the shadows, I saw it. A pair of eyes staring at me from the darkness. Unblinking, unfeeling. Just watching. It was alive. And it was waiting for me. I don't remember how I left the basement. One moment I was standing in that cold, dark room, staring at the eyes watching me from the shadows, and the next I was outside, gasping for air. My hands were shaking, my body trembling with a cold I couldn't explain, even though I was outside now, away from the house, away from whatever had been lurking down there. I don't know how long I stood there on the porch, staring at the house, the air thick and heavy with dread. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe that the door I had opened, the thing I had seen, hadn't been real. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't even come close to uncovering the truth. There was something far darker at work in that house, something that I had only glimpsed, only touched, but not understood. As the sky grew darker, I realized I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. Not with that thing, whatever it was, watching me. I had to leave for good, burn the memory of this place from my mind. But something inside me, something I couldn't control, made me take one last look. I turned and glanced back at the house. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the upstairs window watching me. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The house was old and the glass was stained with years of dust and grime. But no, the figure was there. Standing perfectly still, its face obscured by the shadows, its posture unnaturally rigid. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the panic rising as I realized that whatever was inside that house, whatever had been calling me back, was not finished with me. I turned and ran. My feet carried me away from the house, down the street, down the darkened road, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. But even then, even as the lights of the town grew distant in my rearview mirror, I felt it. The weight of its presence. The curse of the house. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew it was still there. Watching. Waiting. It had been there before I moved in, and it would be there after I was gone. I didn't want to believe it, but the thought clung to me like a shadow. It was still out there, in the house, in the walls, in the very ground itself. And there was no escaping it. I tried to put it behind me. I tried to start fresh in a new town, a new home, but the dreams came. They were always the same. Me standing in that basement, staring at the figure on the altar, feeling the eyes on me, hearing that voice whisper in the dark. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk, it was haunting me. I couldn't outrun it. No matter where I went, I felt its presence. The house had imprinted itself on my soul, and no matter how far I ran, it would always be there, waiting for the next person to stumble into its grip. I thought about the people who would come after me, the next tenant. The next poor soul who would move into that house, not knowing what waited for them. Would they hear the footsteps at night? The whispers? Would they open the door to the basement and discover the same thing I had? Would they make the same mistake? And I knew deep down that they would. Because once you've been marked by the house, there's no escape. It doesn't let go. And if you're unlucky enough to step inside, you're never really free. I don't know if anyone else ever moved in after me. I don't know if the house ever claimed another victim. But every time I close my eyes, I hear it. The whisper. The voice. The promise that the house is waiting. And I know it's true. Will always be true. No one ever really leaves. Not the way they think. I've been running for so long now. It feels like I'm caught in an endless cycle. Constantly fleeing, always looking over my shoulder, never staying in one place for too long. The memories of the house have burned themselves into my mind, so vivid that I can barely tell where reality ends and nightmare begins. I never went back to the town, never even looked at another house. I couldn't. Every time I saw an old building, a dark window, I'd freeze, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. The things I'd felt, the things I'd seen, they lingered. It didn't matter how far away I got, the fear always followed, growing stronger with every passing day. I've stayed in motels, apartments, any place that didn't have an address or a name that could tie me back to anything resembling home. I thought it would help. I thought if I just kept moving, kept running, it would all eventually fade away. But it hasn't. I found myself at a new place last week. A small town in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where nothing ever happens and everyone knows your name. It was quiet, peaceful. A perfect place to start over, to pretend like nothing had ever happened. But even here in this tiny, quiet town, I can feel it. The feeling that I'm being watched. I didn't want to admit it at first. I told myself I was just paranoid, that it was all in my head. I tried to convince myself that I was just adjusting to a new place, but something was wrong. I could feel the eyes on me just like in that house. The weight of the darkness pressing in, curling around my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, but every night when I lay in bed I could hear the sound. The same sound. A creaking like someone was walking through the house. Slowly. Deliberately. Sometimes it was so faint that I thought I imagined it, but it was always there, like a whisper just at the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the house settling like all the others before it. But I knew better now. I knew that wasn't the truth. Last night, the door to my bedroom creaked open. I didn't hear anyone come in, but the door opened and I felt the cold air rush in. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt so real, so tangible, like someone was standing there watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited and then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy and slow, like they were taking their time, savoring the fear they were causing. They moved toward the bed. Toward me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, feel the presence standing right beside me. The cold air pressed against my skin and the whisper came again. Asterisk, you shouldn't have left. Asterisk. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of something beyond my understanding. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. The door slammed shut and I was left in the silence, gasping for air, heart pounding in my ears. I ran out of the house this morning, not caring about my things, not caring about anything but getting away from the feeling that it was still here. That whatever had followed me from that cursed house had found me again. But this time I couldn't outrun it. The fear is everywhere. I've spent the whole day trying to tell myself that I'm just being irrational, that I'm imagining things. But deep down, I know the truth. The house didn't just haunt me, it followed me. The curse didn't end when I left. It didn't end when I tried to forget. And now I can't escape it. I hear the footsteps again. Not just in the night, but during the day. I hear them in the hallway, in the rooms next to me. And every time I think I'm alone, I feel the cold breath on the back of my neck. The whispers, the footsteps, they're never far away. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending I'm safe. But I can't stop. I can't face it because I know that if I do, I'll never get out. And neither will anyone else. I don't know when the last day of my life started. Feels like it's been a blur, one long, unending stretch of fear, paranoia, and running. But this morning I woke up and for the first time in what feels like forever, I was completely still. I didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to move. My body felt like it had been weighed down by invisible chains, and my mind was a fog of exhaustion. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd had a peaceful night of sleep. Every night, I would fall asleep with one eye open, terrified that the shadows would come alive again, that the house would find me once more. But today was different. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a sense of calm. The dread that had clung to me for so long seemed to fade, as if it had been washed away by some strange, unseen force. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the eyes on me. The whispers were silent, and the footsteps were gone. Maybe it was just the exhaustion talking. Maybe my mind was finally cracking under the pressure, giving me a brief respite. Or maybe something else was at play. I stood up slowly, the quiet of the room almost too loud, like everything had paused, holding its breath. As I looked around the small apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the usual dread, the oppressive weight of fear. It was something worse. A hollow emptiness, as if the world around me had become a mere shadow of itself. I moved to the window, pulling the curtains aside. The sunlight was harsh, too bright. I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the light. There was nothing unusual outside, just the usual street, the empty sidewalks, the cars passing by. But something about it seemed distant, like it wasn't quite real. That's when I heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft, tentative. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again. 3 sharp raps on the door, each one louder than the last. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to know who it was. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was on the other side had been waiting for this moment. I walked to the door slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. With a deep breath, I opened it. There was no one there. I looked down the hallway, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. Just the empty space. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest and my mind was spinning. Was I losing my mind? Was I really hearing things now? But then I saw it. On the floor, right in front of the door, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. My hand shook as I picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on it was barely legible. Asterisk, you're not alone. Asterisk, that was all it said. My stomach churned as I stared at the words. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same as the journal I'd found in the basement. The same as the notes I had seen before, scrawled, frantic, desperate. I wanted to throw it away. Burn it, forget it, move on. But the fear inside me wouldn't let me. It was like a tether that had been pulled tighter, drawing me back in, drawing me toward the house, toward whatever was still waiting for me. I ran to the window again, my eyes scanning the street, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Only the same quiet town, the same peaceful, empty world. But I knew it wasn't peaceful. I knew it wasn't empty. It was watching me. Just like the house had watched me. Just like it always would. I slammed the window shut, the cold air still lingering in the room, and sank to the floor, my head in my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But there was nowhere to go. No place left to hide. I had made the mistake of leaving. And now it was too late. The house had found me again. It had never let go. I could feel it now, pressing in from all sides, a cold, suffocating presence that surrounded me. It was in the walls, in the floors, in the very air I breathed. I had been so focused on running, on escaping, that I had never realized how deep the curse had burrowed into my soul. And now it was here, waiting, and I had no choice but to face it. I can feel it now more than ever. The suffocating weight of it, like the walls are closing in around me. I've spent my whole life running, first from the house, then from the memories, and now from the knowledge that I've never truly escaped. Last night, the silence was broken by something else. A sound so faint that at first I thought it was my imagination, just the remnants of a nightmare still clinging to me. But then it came again. The soft creak of a floorboard somewhere in the apartment. It was too familiar, a sound I knew too well. And then the whispering, low and slow, barely audible but clear as day. Asterisk, I'm still here. Asterisk. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My breath quickened, and for a long moment I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but listen. The creaking continued, inching closer to my bedroom door. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by the knowledge that whatever haunted me wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to convince myself it was all just in my head. That maybe I dreamt it, or maybe it was just the house settling like the others before it. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house, the thing that had followed me, was here, and it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stood up slowly, my body trembling, my legs barely holding me up. I reached for the door handle and turned it, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The cold air hit me like a wall, sharp and biting. It felt like the entire apartment had been dipped in ice. I took a step forward, then another. The silence was deafening, but it was a silence that screamed with anticipation, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to move. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting in the darkness, but I had no choice. I had to. I turned the corner and walked toward the living room, each step echoing in the quiet space. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name, and I could feel my pulse racing faster, pounding in my throat. And then I saw it. The faintest outline of a figure standing by the window, its back to me. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, moving in a way that wasn't quite right. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that had never been alive. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as the figure turned slowly toward me. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a blur, shifting and contorting like smoke, like something that shouldn't exist in this world. But the eyes were the only thing I could see clearly. Empty, hollow, and black. They bore into me with such intensity that I felt my very soul being dragged into them. I took a step back, but it was no use. The thing was moving, gliding toward me, its form stretching and warping with every step, like it was being pulled by some unseen force. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a rasp. a hiss that seemed to come from all directions at once. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the grip of whatever this thing was. And then I felt it, cold as death, pressing against me, suffocating me. "It's too late," it whispered again. I couldn't breathe. The air was gone, replaced by that cold, choking grip. I thought I was going to pass out, thought I was going to die right there in that living room. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was silent again, save for the sound of my frantic breathing, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I ran. I didn't care about anything but getting out of there. I didn't stop until I reached the door, until I was outside, away from the apartment. The night air was freezing, but it was a relief, a brief moment of clarity in a world that had gone mad. But as I stood there on the street, my body shaking, my heart still racing, I realized something. It wasn't over. I could hear the footsteps again, faint but growing louder. I turned, my heart dropping into my stomach. There, in the doorway of the apartment, I saw it again, the figure, its black eyes staring at me from the darkness. It was still there. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the thing, but eventually I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I'm not sure where I am now. I've moved from place to place, never staying long enough for anything to feel real. I can still hear it sometimes, the footsteps, the whispers, the cold breath against my skin. And I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. It always does. And when it does, there will be nowhere left to run. Story 3. I remember the day I first saw the house. It was a dreary morning, the kind where the sky is covered in thick, gray clouds, and the air feels heavy, like it's about to rain but never does. I had just moved to this small town, hoping for a fresh start, away from the chaos of my previous life. The divorce was final, and my ex had taken everything but the memories. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could just exist without all the noise of the past. When I found the listing for this place, I didn't hesitate. The rent was cheap, which seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate, and I thought I'd found my escape. The house was old, but it had character. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the empty rooms, the air musty with years of neglect. There was a strange charm to it, despite its age. The walls were a faded shade of yellow, and the windows, though large, let in very little light. Everything seemed a little off, but I figured that was just the result of a house that had been left alone for too long. I unpacked my things that afternoon, trying to make the space my own. The room I chose was in the back of the house, overlooking the small, overgrown yard. I liked the idea of being far from the street, tucked away in my own little world. As I settled in, I began to notice the house's quirks. At night, there were strange sounds, scratching, creaking, faint whispers that seemed to float through the air. But I chalked it up to the age of the place. Old houses have a way of making noises. The walls groan and shift, and the floors settle. It wasn't anything that kept me up at night. It was only a few days before I met my neighbor, Mrs. Connolly, who lived in the house next door. She was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with a warm smile and a slightly frazzled appearance. She was the first person I spoke to since moving in, and she seemed nice enough. She told me how she had lived in the neighborhood for years and was happy to have someone new move in. But then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the house's past. She leaned in a little closer, as if sharing a secret, and said, "You know, there's something strange about that place. You'll probably hear a lot of things at night, footsteps, whispers, things like that. The last tenants, they never lasted long. One night, I heard someone running out of there, scared out of their wits. Said something about curses. I don't know. I just thought I'd warn you." I was taken aback by her words, but I didn't want to let on that I was uneasy. "I'm sure it's just the house settling," I said with a weak smile. "Old houses do that, right?" She nodded, but her eyes didn't leave mine. There was something in her gaze, something I couldn't quite place, that made me uneasy. She quickly changed the subject, and we talked for a few more minutes before she excused herself and went inside. I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said, though. It felt almost like a warning, as if she wanted me to be prepared for something. But I pushed it out of my mind. I didn't believe in curses or supernatural happenings. I wasn't that type of person. That night, as I lay in bed, the house seemed quieter than usual. The wind had died down, and the only sound I could hear was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. I tried to sleep, but there was an unease in the air that I couldn't shake. The silence was too still, too heavy. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway outside my room. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another creak. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps like someone walking down the hall. My heart raced. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the natural sounds of an old building. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming closer and closer until they were right outside my door. I sat up in bed, frozen. My mind was racing, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was just a neighbor walking around, or maybe it was just the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the door creaked. It wasn't enough to open, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I got out of bed and walked cautiously to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that clung to the air, as if something was waiting for me to open the door. I didn't open the door that night. Instead, I locked it and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up over my head. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed amplified in the silence of the house. I lay awake for hours, listening to the creaks and groans of the old structure. But eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress of the move, the change in my life. But something had shifted in me. I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something in this house, something that didn't belong. And as the days passed, the feeling only grew stronger. The days after that strange night seemed to blur together. I kept myself busy with unpacking and setting up, trying to make the house feel more like home. But every time I walked through the rooms, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. The creaks in the floorboards seemed louder, the air thicker. At night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was still adjusting to being in a new place. But it wasn't just my nerves. The footsteps, those slow, deliberate steps, returned every night. I would hear them at the same time, around midnight like a ritual. They'd start far away, echoing down the hall, getting closer and closer, until they stopped right outside my door. Every time, my heart would pound in my chest and I would hold my breath, praying that it would stop. But it never did. The steps would linger as if waiting for something. Waiting for me to open the door, maybe. I started locking the door at night, but even that didn't bring me peace. The air in the house grew colder. In the mornings, I would find the windows cracked open just a little, even though I was sure I had closed them the night before. I checked the locks. They were fine. But somehow the house always felt wrong. Then one afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Connolly again. I had just come back from the grocery store and she was sitting on her porch, rocking back and forth in an old chair. She looked up when I approached and gave me a warm smile, though her eyes seemed distant, almost like she was lost in thought. "How are you settling in?" she asked, her voice friendly, but there was an edge to it, something that made me pause before answering. "It's all right," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "A little unsettling at times, but I'm getting used to it." I had never mentioned the footsteps to her, not wanting to sound paranoid, but something about her made me think she knew more than she let on. She raised an eyebrow, as if she had been expecting me to say something like that. "You're not the first one to say that," she said softly, almost to herself. "You know, the house's history, it's not a pleasant one." I raised an eyebrow, curious now. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Connolly looked around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The last tenants, they were here for a few months. One night they just left. In the middle of the night. The woman came running out of that house, babbling about curses and things that should never have been done. She didn't make any sense, poor thing. But she wasn't the first. A lot of people who've lived there have left in a hurry." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of things? What curses?" She shrugged, her eyes flickering nervously. "I don't know. People say the original owner was into strange things, dark things. They say he was obsessed with the occult, that he did rituals in the basement. The neighbors hear things sometimes, whispers, footsteps, like someone's walking around when there's no one there. Some say he opened a door to something that shouldn't be opened." My stomach twisted. I had already been uneasy in the house, but hearing this only made it worse. "So, you think the house is cursed?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I don't know. But there's something there, something that doesn't want to be found. If you start hearing things, don't be surprised. And whatever you do, don't go down to the basement. Not at night. People say things are still down there." I didn't know what to say. I had heard enough, but at the same time, I didn't want to let my fear control me. Mrs. Connolly didn't say much more before she excused herself and went back inside her house. I stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. The house's past was darker than I had imagined, and now I couldn't shake the thought that whatever it was, whatever curse lingered there, it was watching me. That night, the footsteps returned. But this time, something was different. They were louder, closer. They weren't just echoing down the hall. They were coming from right outside my door. I lay in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, my fingers gripping the covers. The floorboards creaked and the air grew cold. I heard a faint whisper, almost too soft to hear, but it was there, just at the edge of my consciousness. I sat up in bed, my body trembling. Something wasn't right. I knew I wasn't imagining it anymore. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard something else, a scratching sound like nails on wood coming from the other side of the door. My breath caught in my throat. It sounded like something was trying to get in. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. And then it happened. The door handle turned. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I watched in terror as the handle slowly, agonizingly turned. And then the door creaked open, just enough for a cold draft to rush into the room. But there was nothing there. Nothing at all. Just an empty hallway. I stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I shut the door, locked it, and huddled in bed, my mind racing. Tomorrow I would figure out what had happened here. Tomorrow I would find out the truth about the house. And I would end whatever was haunting it, if I could. The following day, I couldn't shake the lingering fear that wrapped itself around me like a cold blanket. I barely slept, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. The scratching, the handle turning, it felt too real to have been just a nightmare. But how could I explain it? No one else had ever seen anything like that, at least not that I knew of. Mrs. Connolly's words echoed in my head, her warning about the basement, about the house's cursed history. I knew I needed to find out more. I needed answers, or at least an explanation. I spent the morning gathering what little I knew about the house. There wasn't much in the way of public records, but I had a feeling that Mrs. Connolly, despite her cryptic warnings, knew more than she was letting on. She might not have had the courage to face whatever was in that house, but I couldn't live like this. I had to know what I was up against. By afternoon, I was back at the house, standing in front of the basement door. I hadn't dared to go down there yet, but the time had come. Mrs. Connolly's warning was still fresh in my mind. Whatever you do, don't go down to the basement. Not at night. The words repeated themselves like a chant, trying to keep me from turning the doorknob. I had to know what was down there. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was fear. Fear that something was hunting me, something that was tied to the house, and if I didn't confront it, it would only get worse. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, took a deep breath, and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I felt a gust of cold air hit me, stronger than before. The smell down there was musty, like damp earth and mildew. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, but the beam didn't seem to go far enough to reveal anything. The staircase leading down seemed to stretch on into infinity, the steps dark and narrow. I hesitated, my heart racing. But I couldn't turn back now. Taking one cautious step after another, I descended into the basement, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself was pulling me deeper into its dark secret. When I reached the bottom, I was met with the full brunt of the cold air. It was as if the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. My breath fogged in front of me as I scanned the basement. It was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and piles of forgotten things. But what caught my eye was an old wooden chest, shoved against the far wall. It looked out of place among the other junk, too old, too worn. I moved toward it, my heart thudding in my chest. The chest was heavy but not locked. When I pried it open, I found a stack of old journals, their pages yellowed with age. My hands shook as I picked one up, wiping away the dust. The cover was plain, unmarked, but the smell of old paper filled my nostrils as I flipped it open. The handwriting inside was neat but erratic, as if the writer was trying to get something down before it escaped them. The entries were fragmented, a collection of thoughts and experiences that didn't quite make sense. But there were a few that caught my attention. One entry was dated several years ago. Asterisk, the ritual has begun. The house is alive, feeding off our fear. It grows stronger each day. I can hear it, hear the whispers in the walls, the scratching at the door. I've tried to close the door, but it will not stay shut. I think it's watching me. I think it's waiting. Asterisk. My stomach turned as I read on. Another entry. Asterisk, I opened the door. I shouldn't have. I thought it was just superstition, but now I know the truth. It's real. There's something inside, something from another world. And it's hungry. Asterisk. I couldn't breathe. The words were like a punch to the gut. Whoever had written these entries had been trying to warn someone, anyone, but they had failed. The door the journal spoke of, it had to be referring to the basement, the very place I was standing. I grabbed the other journals, desperate to find more, but then I froze. A sound echoed in the basement, A soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. My heart leaped into my throat. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I turned around slowly, shining the flashlight toward the sound. The beam swept across the dark corners of the basement, but there was nothing there. My breath was shallow and I could feel the cold creeping into my bones. Another thud. This time it was closer. I backed away from the chest, my eyes darting around the room. The darkness felt thick, suffocating. My mind raced. Could it be another animal, a rat or a raccoon? No, this was something else. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I heard it again, this time unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and heavy, dragging something along the floor. I whipped the flashlight around, but the beam landed on nothing. The sound was all around me now, closer, as if something, or someone, was walking just out of sight. I bolted for the stairs, the flashlight flicking wildly as I rushed up them. My heart was in my throat and I stumbled on the last step. I didn't care. I needed to get out of that basement, away from whatever was down there. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I stood there, panting, my back pressed against the door. But even as I tried to steady my breathing, the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, somewhere in the house, just out of sight. I was no longer safe. Whatever had been in that basement, it wasn't confined there anymore. It was here. And it wasn't going anywhere. It was waiting for me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. Even with the door locked, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there was getting closer, that it was studying me, learning my routines. I kept hearing the dragging, the heavy thud of something moving across the floor, creeping up the stairs. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that the house was old and creaky, that the wind must have been making those sounds. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't just an old house settling. This was something else. The morning light brought no comfort. I had to leave the house for a while to clear my head. The walls felt like they were closing in on me and I needed to breathe, to think. Maybe I could go to a coffee shop, distract myself for a few hours, but even then I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. The idea of being alone in that house again filled me with dread. Before I left, I decided to check the journals once more. There had to be something more in them, some clue I missed. I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one that seemed to have been left behind by whoever lived here before. On the surface it looked ordinary, papers, pens, a few old photos. But as I pulled open the drawer, something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound notebook, different from the others. I opened it, flipping through the pages. At first glance, it seemed like another journal, but the writing was much more frantic. The words were scribbled quickly, as if the writer couldn't write fast enough to get their thoughts down. Asterisk, it's too late. The door is open. I can hear it now, its voice in the walls, its breath on the back of my neck. I've tried to escape, but it follows me. It never lets me go. The house knows me. It's inside me. Asterisk. The words made my skin crawl. Whoever wrote this had been terrified. They spoke of the same thing, the door. The same door I had just found in the basement. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck as I read on. Asterisk, I've seen it in the reflection of the mirrors. It's not human. It's something else, something ancient, something hungry. I thought I could fight it, but now I know the truth. It's not just the house. The house is just a prison. It's the land, the ground beneath us. It was cursed long ago. And I'm the last to suffer. Asterisk. I slammed the notebook shut, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the key to everything. I knew that the house had some dark history, but now it seemed like the land itself was cursed, bound by something far older and more powerful than I could ever have imagined. I needed to leave. I had to get out of this place before it consumed me like it had consumed whoever came before. But as I turned to leave the living room, I froze. The air was still, far too still. A thick silence filled the room, a silence that was too heavy, too unnatural. Then I heard it, whispers, soft but clear like a distant chant. My body went rigid and I turned toward the sound, my heart racing. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls, seeping through the cracks like a poison. I knew what it was. The house was speaking to me. The floorboards creaked and I slowly backed away, unable to take my eyes off the spot where the whispers came from. They weren't just voices anymore. Now I could hear footsteps too, faint but unmistakable. They were getting closer, dragging along the floor. I grabbed my coat, the cold air biting at my skin as I rushed to the door. But before I could open it, the room went dark. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving me in complete darkness. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then in the silence came a new sound. A scratching, soft but relentless, coming from behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But something in me forced my body to move, to glance over my shoulder. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, was a figure. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was tall, far too tall for any normal human being. Its body was thin, skeletal even, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it wore a smile, a wide, chilling grin that sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. It wasn't smiling because it was friendly. No, it was smiling because it enjoyed the fear it was causing. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and predatory, boring into me. The scratching sound continued, now coming from all around me as if the walls themselves were alive. I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the handle, but when I finally yanked it open, I heard something I will never forget. A voice. A low, guttural whisper right next to my ear. Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk. I slammed the door behind me, and as I stepped outside, I realized I had left the house far behind. But the voice, the whispers, they still followed me. The air around me felt thick with them, suffocating. I didn't know where I was running or how long I had been running, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. I had escaped the house, but whatever was inside it wasn't going to let me go that easily. It was still out there, waiting for the next person to step into its grasp. I spent the next few days in a daze, not knowing where I was or what had just happened. I couldn't get the images of the thing, whatever it was, out of my mind. The tall, skeletal figure with that twisted smile. The whispers that had followed me even after I ran out of the house. My skin crawled every time I closed my eyes, the fear still gnawing at my gut. I stayed with a friend for a few nights, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of moving to a new town, adjusting to a new life after the divorce, had all gotten to me. Maybe I had just snapped. But something deep inside me told me I was wrong. I had seen it, felt it. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. I couldn't stay at my friend's place forever, though. I needed to figure out what was happening. I needed to know the truth about the house, the curse, the thing that haunted it. I couldn't let it control me. It had already taken so much. My peace of mind, my sense of safety, my belief in what was real and what wasn't. I went back to the house that afternoon. There was no way I was going to let it take over my life. I had to face it. The moment I stepped onto the property, the familiar weight of unease settled over me. The house stood there, dark and looming, as though it had been waiting for me to return. I wasn't sure if I was braver or just desperate, but I found myself walking toward the front door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The door opened with a groan. I hesitated, staring into the dim hallway. It felt colder inside, the air thick and heavy with the same oppressive silence that had gripped me before. But now there was something else, an undeniable presence, as though I was no longer alone. I stepped in, my shoes making a hollow sound against the wooden floors. The place was exactly as I remembered it. Dust settled in the corners and the wallpaper in the hallway peeled at the edges. Everything seemed frozen in time. But it wasn't the house that had changed, it was me. I had been marked by something, and I wasn't sure if I could ever leave without it following me. The air was heavier than before. The house seemed to be breathing with me, its walls expanding and contracting as I moved. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, watching the shadows stretch unnaturally as I walked deeper into the house. I made my way to the basement. I had to know more about the door. The journal had mentioned something about it being a passage, a gateway. I had to see it with my own eyes to understand how it all tied together. The basement was just as cold and damp as I remembered. The staircase creaked under my weight as I descended. I reached the bottom and stared at the far wall where the door was. It looked like an ordinary wooden door, nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. But the closer I got, the more I could feel it. The wrongness of it. The way the air around it seemed to hum like it was alive. I reached for the handle, my heart racing, and pulled the door open. What I saw beyond it made my breath catch in my throat. The room was unlike anything I had seen before. It was small, but the walls stretched upward, far beyond what should have been possible in this old house. The ceiling was high, covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. The room smelled faintly of something burning like incense, but mixed with a metallic scent I couldn't place. There, in the center of the room, was an altar. It was crude, made of old stone, but the markings on it were unmistakable. Ritualistic. Dark. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the space, and that's when I saw it. A mirror. It was leaning against the far wall, covered in dust, but it was still unnerving. It seemed too large for the room, too perfect. And it was reflecting something that wasn't there. Something I couldn't see. I walked closer, almost as if compelled by something beyond my control. The reflection in the mirror, it wasn't my own. I stared at the glass, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure in the reflection was tall, like the one I had seen before, but now it was standing behind me, looking right at me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew without a doubt that whatever it was real. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. A chill ran down my spine as I reached for the mirror, my fingers trembling. The moment my hand touched the cold glass, the room shifted. The walls seemed to pulse, the symbols on the ceiling flickering like firelight. The thing in the reflection grinned, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. And then its hand reached out through the mirror toward me. I yanked my hand back in panic, but it was too late. The glass rippled like water, and I felt a coldness sweep through me deep into my bones. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the altar. The room spun, and I heard the whisper again. Louder this time, closer. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk. The mirror cracked, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The thing on the other side vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence. I ran. I ran from the basement, from the house, from whatever it was that had been waiting for me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath short and ragged. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there in the shadows following me. As I reached the street, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I turned around, half expecting to see the house still standing there, waiting, but it was gone. In its place was a field. Empty. Silent. And yet, I could still hear the whispers in the wind, telling me that I had only just begun to understand what was truly inside that house. I spent the next few days in a daze, not knowing where I was or what had just happened. I couldn't get the images of the thing, whatever it was, out of my mind. The tall, skeletal figure with that twisted smile. The whispers that had followed me even after I ran out of the house. My skin crawled every time I closed my eyes, the fear still gnawing at my gut. I stayed with a friend for a few nights, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of moving to a new town, adjusting to a new life after the divorce, had all gotten to me. Maybe I had just snapped. But something deep inside me told me I was wrong. I had seen it, felt it. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. I couldn't stay at my friend's place forever, though. I needed to figure out what was happening. I needed to know the truth about the house, the curse, the thing that haunted it. I couldn't let it control me. It had already taken so much. My peace of mind, my sense of safety, my belief in what was real and what wasn't. I went back to the house that afternoon. There was no way I was going to let it take over my life. I had to face it. The moment I stepped onto the property, the familiar weight of unease settled over me. The house stood there, dark and looming, as though it had been waiting for me to return. I wasn't sure if I was braver or just desperate, but I found myself walking toward the front door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The door opened with a groan. I hesitated, staring into the dim hallway. It felt colder inside, the air thick and heavy with the same oppressive silence that had gripped me before. But now there was something else, an undeniable presence, as though I was no longer alone. I stepped in, my shoes making a hollow sound against the wooden floors. The place was exactly as I remembered it. Dust settled in the corners, and the wallpaper in the hallway peeled at the edges. Everything seemed frozen in time. But it wasn't the house that had changed, it was me. I had been marked by something, and I wasn't sure if I could ever leave without it following me. The air was heavier than before. The house seemed to be breathing with me, its walls expanding and contracting as I moved. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, watching the shadows stretch unnaturally as I walked deeper into the house. I made my way to the basement. I had to know more about the door. The journal had mentioned something about it being a passage, a gateway. I had to see it with my own eyes to understand how it all tied together. The basement was just as cold and damp as I remembered. The staircase creaked under my weight as I descended. I reached the bottom and stared at the far wall where the door was. It looked like an ordinary wooden door, nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. But the closer I got, the more I could feel it. The wrongness of it. The way the air around it seemed to hum like it was alive. I reached for the handle, my heart racing, and pulled the door open. What I saw beyond it made my breath catch in my throat. The room was unlike anything I had seen before. It was small, but the walls stretched upward, far beyond what should have been possible in this old house. The ceiling was high, covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. The room smelled faintly of something burning like incense, but mixed with a metallic scent I couldn't place. There, in the center of the room, was an altar. It was crude, made of old stone, but the markings on it were unmistakable. Ritualistic. Dark. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the space, and that's when I saw it. A mirror. It was leaning against the far wall, covered in dust, but it was still unnerving. It seemed too large for the room, too perfect. And it was reflecting something that wasn't there. Something I couldn't see. I walked closer, almost as if compelled by something beyond my control. The reflection in the mirror, it wasn't my own. I stared at the glass, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure in the reflection was tall, like the one I had seen before, but now it was standing behind me, looking right at me. I didn't dare turn around. I knew without a doubt that whatever it was real. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. A chill ran down my spine as I reached for the mirror, my fingers trembling. The moment my hand touched the cold glass, the room shifted. The walls seemed to pulse, the symbols on the ceiling flickering like firelight. The thing in the reflection grinned, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. And then its hand reached out through the mirror toward me. I yanked my hand back in panic, but it was too late. The glass rippled like water, and I felt a coldness sweep through me deep into my bones. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the altar. The room spun, and I heard the whisper again. Louder this time, closer. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk. The mirror cracked, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The thing on the other side vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence. I ran. I ran from the basement, from the house, from whatever it was that had been waiting for me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath short and ragged. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there in the shadows following me. As I reached the street, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I turned around, half expecting to see the house still standing there, waiting, but it was gone. In its place was a field. Empty. Silent. And yet, I could still hear the whispers in the wind, telling me that I had only just begun to understand what was truly inside that house. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cracked mirror, the thing behind it grinning at me with its hollow eyes. The whispers that had followed me from the house still echoed in my mind. You shouldn't have come back. It felt like a curse, a warning, or maybe both. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The next few days passed in a blur. I avoided the house, but I couldn't avoid the memories. I'd moved to this town for a fresh start, to get away from the chaos of my past, but everything about this place felt wrong. There was an undeniable pull, a connection to that house that I couldn't explain. I tried to talk to people, to distract myself, but I found myself constantly drawn back to the house. I began to ask around town, hoping to find someone who could shed some light on the strange history of that place. The woman at the local bookstore seemed to know more than she let on. She had been kind when I asked about the house, but her face had gone pale when I mentioned the previous owners. She hesitated, then leaned in, whispering as if afraid someone might overhear. People around here don't talk much about that house, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's cursed. At least that's what they say. The family who lived there, they weren't normal. They were different. Obsessed with things that weren't meant to be meddled with. She stopped herself, eyes darting to the door. Look, if you want to know more, talk to Jack. He lives a few streets over. He used to live near the house a long time ago. You might know more. But I warn you, stay away from that place. It doesn't let go once it has you. I left the bookstore with a sense of dread heavy in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I knew I had to keep going. I had already been marked by whatever haunted that house. There was no escaping it now. Jack turned out to be an older man, his face lined with years of hard living. He had a deep, gravelly voice and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. I found him sitting on his porch, rocking back and forth in a chair, his eyes focused on something only he could see. When I told him I had questions about the house, his eyes sharpened. He glanced around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Folks don't like talking about that place, he muttered, his voice low. But you came to the right person, I guess. I don't know how much help I'll be, but I can tell you this. It's not the house that's haunted. It's what's in it. What was put there. He paused, then looked at me seriously. You need to understand something. The family that lived there, they didn't just live there. They worshiped things. They dabbled in things no one should ever touch. The old man, he had books. Books on rituals, on summoning. He thought he could open doors to other places. He thought he could control whatever was on the other side. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling faintly of whiskey. They say he succeeded. And when he did, something came through. Something that never left. A cold shiver ran down my spine as Jack's words sank in. The old man had opened something, a doorway to a realm or force that had never been meant to cross into this world. I thought back to the altar I had seen in the basement, the symbols carved into the walls. The rituals, the dark energy. It all made sense now. But it didn't make it any less terrifying. "You're not the first one to get drawn in by that house," Jack continued, his voice trembling with something between fear and regret. "A man lived there before you about 10 years ago. Ran out of there screaming like a madman. Said he saw things that weren't supposed to be. The last time anyone saw him, he was babbling about curses and doors. Told people the house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. And those who stayed there too long, well, they started to change. They weren't the same." I could feel the air growing thicker, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway, a place where something terrible had slipped through and refused to leave. "Don't go back there," Jack warned. "You don't know what you're dealing with. If it's already got its hooks in you, there's only one way to stop it. You need to leave town. Leave it all behind." But it was too late for that. I had already felt its presence. It was in my head, in my dreams. It followed me. And no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That the thing from the mirror was waiting for me to come back. I didn't know if I could leave now. There was something drawing me back to that house. A need to understand, to confront whatever haunted it. I had to know what had happened to those who came before me, to learn how to close the door that had been opened. That night I went back. I stood outside the house once more, staring up at its decaying facade. The sky had darkened and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the yard. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, reaching out toward me as if beckoning me inside. I didn't know what I expected to find. I didn't know if I was walking into my own demise or into a twisted revelation. But I had to know. I stepped forward, my feet heavy as I crossed the threshold. And the door creaked closed behind me. The moment the door closed, the house seemed to exhale. A low, groaning sound rattled through the walls and the temperature in the hallway dropped. My breath became visible, swirling in the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked with every step, as if the house was groaning in protest to my presence. I could almost hear it whispering, urging me to turn back, to leave before it consumed me. But there was no turning back now. I had come for answers, and I was determined to find them, no matter the cost. My feet carried me down the narrow hall, past the door to the living room, where the faintest flicker of light seemed to come from under the crack. It was too dim to make out what it was, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was waiting for me. I walked towards the room. The air grew heavier as I drew closer, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. When I pushed the door open, a cold gust of wind rushed past me, though the windows were shut tight. The light flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls, twisting and distorting the shapes they touched. I stepped inside and immediately felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong here, more than the house itself. The room had the familiar feeling of something out of place, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The furniture was covered in dust, but there was something else. The smell of decay was more pungent in this room, mixing with the faint odor of something metallic. The faint flicker of light continued, dancing across the walls as if it had a life of its own. The shadowy shapes on the walls seemed to shift with each passing second, moving too quickly, too deliberately. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't suppress the sense that I was being watched. I glanced over at the old bookshelf in the corner, its once proud shelves sagging under the weight of time and neglect. Among the cracked bindings and tattered pages, one book stood out, a thick leather-bound tome that seemed out of place. The cover was etched with strange symbols, their meaning lost to time, but the mark felt familiar. I had seen these symbols before, on the walls in the basement. This was no ordinary book. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I slid it from the shelf. The moment I touched it, the air in the room seemed to shift, thickening. The whispering grew louder, as though the house itself was speaking to me, urgently, insistently. My mind raced, my thoughts spinning out of control as I opened the book. The pages were yellowed with age, brittle beneath my fingers, but the writing was sharp, precise. It was in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood it. The words seemed to crawl into my mind, unwelcome but impossible to ignore. They told of a man, an occultist, obsessed with opening doors to other realms, to places where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. As I read, the sense of dread grew, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't look away from the words, couldn't stop reading, even though every part of me screamed to shut the book and run. The text spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, and of the door, the one that had been opened in this very house, letting something in that could never leave. I skimmed through the pages, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a passage that stopped me dead in my tracks. Those who open the door, it read, will hear the whispers long after the door is closed. They will see shadows in the corners of their eyes. They will feel the cold touch of fingers on their skin, and they will hear footsteps that follow them, even in the safety of their own homes. The house is not just a building. It is a prison, a gateway, a lure. The thing inside will wait until it finds a way out. I slammed the book shut, gasping for air. My heart felt like it was about to explode from my chest. I stared at the book, the feeling of cold dread wrapping around me tighter than ever. But that wasn't all. As I caught my breath, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The shadows in the room had shifted. They were no longer dancing across the walls. They were moving toward me. The faintest outline of a figure materialized in the far corner of the room, its shape indistinct, like a smear of dark ink against the pale wall. It was tall, too tall. The figure swayed as though caught in an unseen breeze, and though I could see no eyes, I felt them on me, watching, waiting. I backed away, my pulse quickening. The whispering had stopped, but a strange pressure filled the air, like the room had become smaller, tighter, and it was closing in on me. I needed to get out, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the floor. Then the figure stepped forward. I screamed, my voice cracking in panic, but the sound seemed to vanish into the oppressive silence of the house. The figure was close now, impossibly close, its presence overwhelming. It felt like I was suffocating, like something was squeezing the life out of me. I turned and bolted for the door. But before I could reach it, a cold, clammy hand wrapped around my wrist, stopping me in my tracks. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I felt the skin on my wrist burn with an icy touch that shouldn't have been possible. With all my strength, I wrenched my arm free, stumbling backward. I turned and ran, crashing through the hallway, barely able to see through the blinding fear and panic clouding my vision. The house seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as I dashed toward the front door. I flung the door open and ran into the night, gasping for breath as the cold air hit my face. My mind raced, my body trembling, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't know what I had just encountered in that house, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't finished with me, and it wasn't about to let me leave. As I reached the safety of the street, I glanced back at the house. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. And then, the whispering began again. This time it wasn't from the house. It was in my ear. You shouldn't have come back. I ran. I don't know how far or how fast, but I didn't stop. The air felt heavy in my lungs, and my legs burned as I stumbled through the streets, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. I didn't dare look behind me, terrified of what I might see. When I finally slowed down, panting and shaking with fear, I found myself standing in the middle of a quiet street, far from the house. It was as though the world had frozen around me, silent, still, and completely indifferent to the chaos inside my mind. The streets were empty. The houses dark. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I wanted to believe it was over. That the house had released me, that whatever had been haunting me had been left behind in those dark rooms. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The house had marked me. I turned in a slow circle, trying to steady myself, trying to breathe. But the air felt wrong. Thin. Hollow. I couldn't shake the oppressive weight that had settled over me, as if the very atmosphere had been corrupted by whatever had come through that door. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the contacts. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. But who would believe me? Who would understand the kind of terror I had experienced? And then there was the truth I was too afraid to face. The truth that the house was still in my head. I had to know more. I couldn't live with the uncertainty. I couldn't leave without understanding what had happened, what was still happening. I called Kate. She was the only person I trusted enough to tell about what had happened, though I wasn't sure what I was even going to say. I needed to explain it all, but how could I? The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. Hello? Her voice was groggy, the sound of sleep still heavy in her words. Kate, it's me. I need your help. She hesitated. Are you okay? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The memory of the figure in the house, the cold touch, the whispers, it all hit me like a tidal wave. My breath caught in my throat. Are you still at that house? Kate asked, her voice thick with concern. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. I had to leave. I don't know what's happening, Kate. Something's in there. Something. It's not just the house. Something else. I'm not safe. There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear her shifting, likely sitting up in bed. What do you mean? What's going on? I saw something. It was in the house. It's been following me. The house is cursed, Kate. The previous owner, the things they did. I don't know how to explain it, but I think it's not just the house that's haunted. It's me now. I could hear her exhale slowly, as if trying to process what I had said. Are you sure about this? No, I don't know. But I need to know what's happening. I need to find out more about the house. The rituals. The things the original owner did. If we can understand what they were involved in, maybe we can stop this. I felt a momentary sense of relief at speaking to someone about it, but it was fleeting. The terror, the dread, was still there, wrapping itself around my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. I'll help you, Kate said, her voice resolute. But we need to be careful. If what you're saying is true, we need to figure out how to stop it. We can't just leave it alone. Thank you. I don't know what else to do. We'll figure this out. But you need to get somewhere safe first. I'm not sure this is something you can solve alone. I'm already at the street near the house. I don't know what to do now. Stay put. I'm coming to get you. We'll go back to my place. We'll talk and then we'll figure out how to handle this. I was too exhausted to argue. Too drained to think clearly. Okay, I'll wait. I ended the call and stood there, staring out into the dark street. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees and creating a constant eerie sound that seemed to echo around me. And then I heard it. The soft, muffled sound of footsteps. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart began to race, and my hand instinctively went to my pocket, clutching the phone like a lifeline. But there was no one. The street was still empty. I felt my stomach churn as I realized that the footsteps weren't coming from any one person. They were coming from all around me. Echoes of footsteps, layered on top of each other, like the sound of 100 people walking in unison, closing in on me from every direction. I had to get out of there. I turned and started running again, but this time the sounds followed me. The echo of footsteps grew louder with every step, closing in, coming from behind me. My breath was ragged as I ran faster, my legs burning with the effort. I didn't stop until I reached the street corner, where I finally saw the headlights of Kate's car approaching. Relief washed over me, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, still following me, even though I was no longer alone. As I got into the car, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the house in the distance. But instead, there was nothing. The street was empty, devoid of the figure, the house, and the shadows. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything. But then, as Kate pulled away, I heard it. The faintest whisper, so quiet it could have been the wind. Come back. It was the same voice that had whispered to me before. And this time, it felt like it was calling from the shadows, from the house that had never truly let me go. I couldn't shake the feeling. The voice that had whispered to me from the shadows, that was no illusion. It lingered in the back of my mind, haunting every thought, every breath I took. Even as we drove away from the house, I could still hear it, like a distant hum, an echo that wouldn't fade. Kate was quiet as she drove, her eyes focused on the road, but I could tell she was worried. She kept glancing at me as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. The silence in the car was suffocating, so thick I could almost taste it. I stared out the window, trying to block out the racing thoughts that flooded my mind. Was I imagining things? Was I losing it? But I couldn't deny what I had experienced. The house, the footsteps, the whispers, it had all felt too real. And now, even though I was miles away, I still couldn't escape it. Do you feel it too? I asked, my voice hoarse and strained. It felt like I hadn't spoken in hours, even though it had only been a few minutes. Kate didn't answer right away. She was still staring ahead, her knuckles white as they gripped the steering wheel. Finally she spoke, her voice low. I don't know what to feel right now, but I don't think you're imagining things. I turned to face her, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean? She glanced at me, her eyes filled with concern. I don't know exactly, but there's something about that place, about what you told me. It's not just the house. There's something else there, something that's been waiting. I shivered at her words. Waiting. The thought sent a chill through me deep down in my bones. The house wasn't just haunted by the past, it was a prison, a trap. And I had walked right into it, unaware of the consequences. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional swish of tires against the wet pavement. The rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows. The city felt distant, isolated, as though we were the only two people left in the world. When we arrived at her apartment, I barely had the energy to get out of the car. My limbs felt heavy and my mind was numb with fear. Kate led me up to her place, unlocking the door with a soft click. The warmth of her apartment was a stark contrast to the cold night air, but it did little to ease the unease that clung to me. "Sit down," Kate said, guiding me to the couch. "We'll figure this out." I didn't respond. I just sat there, staring blankly at the walls, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The house, the rituals, the whispers. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. Why had I been chosen? Why me? Kate sat down beside me, handing me a glass of water, but I couldn't drink it. I couldn't do anything except sit there, feeling like I was sinking into the very fabric of her couch. "Do you think it's over?" I asked quietly, still staring at nothing. Kate didn't answer right away. She seemed to be thinking, processing what I had told her. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "No, I don't think it's over. But I think we can stop it." I turned to her, my eyes wide. "How? How can we stop it?" Kate's eyes darkened as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We need to find out more about the house, about the rituals. The previous owner didn't just dabble in the occult. They opened something that's still there. We need to understand it if we have any hope of putting it back where it belongs." The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "And if we don't?" Kate didn't look at me. She stared ahead, her eyes distant. "Then it will keep coming. It will keep following you until there's nothing left." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to think about what might happen if we failed. But deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever was haunting me, it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I closed my eyes, the image of the house flashing behind my eyelids, creaking floors, strange smells, whispers in the dark. It all felt so vivid, so real, as if it was still inside me, waiting to consume me from the inside out. "Okay," I said finally, my voice trembling. "What do we do?" Kate stood up, walking over to her bookshelf. She pulled down a dusty old book and handed it to me. It was thick, the leather cover worn with age, the title faded and illegible. "This book," she said softly, "belonged to a friend of mine. She studies the occult. It's got everything you need to know about rituals, curses, the kind of stuff we're dealing with." I took the book from her hands, feeling the weight of it in my palms. It felt wrong, like it shouldn't be in my possession. Like opening it might be the final step into a world I couldn't escape from. Kate sat back down beside me. "We start with the basics. We figure out what happened in that house. We figure out what the original owner did, and we stop it before it's too late." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. There was no going back now. Whatever I was about to do, there was no turning back. I opened the book, flipping through the pages, my fingers trembling as I tried to read the faded text. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something in the back of my mind told me I would know it when I saw it. I stopped at a page near the back. A symbol. A strange, twisted symbol that made my heart race. It was the same symbol I had seen in the house, on the walls, on the floorboards. A mark. A warning. And it was the key to everything. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was still waiting for me. The decision to return to the house wasn't one I made lightly. In fact, the thought of going back sent waves of panic through me. I'd never felt fear like this before, this gnawing, suffocating dread that seemed to have a life of its own, wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter every time I considered the idea. But I had no choice. The symbol in the book, our only lead, was etched into the house. And if I wanted any chance of escaping whatever had been unleashed, I had to confront it head-on. Kate had been surprisingly calm when I told her. There was no doubt in her eyes, no hesitation in her voice as she nodded, her face determined. She didn't question me, didn't argue. She just grabbed her coat and handed me mine. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice steady. I shook my head, my heart pounding at the thought of her getting involved in this. "You don't have to." But Kate's expression was firm. "Yes, I do. You're not going back there alone." And so we drove back in silence. The rain had stopped, leaving a thick fog that clung to the streets. The air felt heavy, like something was waiting, watching, lurking just beyond our vision. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see something, or someone, following us. But the road behind us remained empty, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As we neared the house, I could feel it again, the pull. The same sensation I had when I first stepped through its front door. The house was waiting for us, as if it had never let go, as if it had been keeping track of every moment since we left. I parked the car, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The house stood before us, its windows dark and uninviting, like hollow eyes staring into the soul. The air around it seemed colder, heavier, and I couldn't tell if it was the house itself or something more sinister. Kate grabbed my arm as I made to step out of the car. "We'll do this together, okay?" Her grip was tight, her voice a little shaky, but it gave me a sliver of strength I didn't know I needed. I nodded, though my stomach churned. The house seemed to loom even larger in the fog, its silhouette a dark blot against the night sky. We walked to the front door, the familiar creak of the porch boards underfoot making the hairs on my neck stand up. It was as if the house remembered us, acknowledged our return. My fingers hovered over the handle, my breath shallow, the air thick with the weight of everything that had happened here. When I opened the door, it wasn't the cold gust of air that hit me first. It was the smell. That same rancid, musty scent that had made me feel sick the last time I was here. It filled the entryway, stronger this time, like something that had been festering for years. I stepped inside, Kate right behind me. The house greeted us with the same creaks, the same groans, as if it was alive, shifting and settling under our presence. I could feel the weight of something watching me again, that ever-present pressure on my chest, as if something were just beyond the corner, waiting for me to make a mistake. "What now?" Kate whispered, her voice barely audible over the house's low groaning. I glanced around. The hallway stretched out before us, the same dim, flickering light hanging from the ceiling. There was no warmth here, no comfort. Just cold, oppressive silence. "The symbol," I muttered, more to myself than to Kate. "It has to be in here somewhere." The book said. Suddenly I froze. A sound. Footsteps. I turned my head sharply, my heart racing as I tried to locate the source. But there was nothing. Just the house's old bones creaking under the weight of time. "Did you hear that?" Kate asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, my throat dry. "I heard it." "Where is it coming from?" she asked, her eyes scanning the hallway. I wasn't sure. I didn't know if the footsteps were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but it didn't matter. The sound was undeniable. The house was alive. Alive with something that shouldn't be. I led the way down the hallway, Kate close behind. Every step I took felt like I was walking on fragile glass, afraid to make a sound, afraid to disturb whatever was lurking in the shadows. We stopped in front of the door to the basement. It had been locked the last time we were here, but now the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness greeted us from within, the faintest outline of the stairs leading down into the unknown. I couldn't help myself. I stepped forward, my feet carrying me toward it even as my mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. I had come too far. I had to know. "I'll go first," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Kate didn't protest. She just nodded, her face pale but resolute. I grasped the door handle, my fingers cold against the rusted metal, and pushed the door open wider. The stairs descended into darkness, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. Slowly, carefully, I began to descend, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. Behind me, I heard Kate take a sharp breath, but she didn't say anything. She was right there, behind me, following me into the unknown. The further we went down, the colder it became. The air felt like ice, each breath a fog in the stale, oppressive atmosphere. My footsteps echoed through the basement, the sound bouncing off the walls like an unanswered question. And then we saw it. At the far end of the basement, barely visible in the low light, was an old wooden chest. It looked out of place, as if it had been hidden away for years, untouched by time. My blood ran cold. The chest was familiar. It was the same chest I had seen in the journal, the one used for the occult rituals. The one that had been used to store the cursed objects. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for it, but before I could touch it, I heard it. A whisper. So faint, so soft that I almost thought it was the wind. But it wasn't. It was a voice. A voice I knew all too well. "Leave now." My breath caught in my throat, my heart thundering as I spun around. There was no one there. Just the oppressive darkness swallowing us whole. The whisper grew louder. "Leave now, or it will take you." The voice came from everywhere. The room closed in on me. And that was when I knew whatever had been waiting for me was here. The air around us shifted, growing heavier, colder, pressing in from all sides. The whisper grew more insistent, more forceful, as if the very walls of the basement were alive, conspiring to drag us into its depths. I could feel the weight of it, this overwhelming presence that seemed to stretch and bend reality itself. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned to face Kate, but the look in her eyes told me she was just as terrified as I was. She didn't have to say a word. I could see the panic in her face, her lips trembling, her eyes wide with fear. But there was something else there too, something darker. It was as if she knew somehow that this wasn't just a haunting. It was something worse. Something ancient. The whisper came again, louder this time, vibrating through my skull. Leave now? I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run, wanted to escape, but something held me in place. It was as if the house itself was drawing me deeper into its embrace, its clutches wrapping around my mind, my thoughts, my very soul. I turned toward the chest, knowing I couldn't leave without understanding what it contained. The journal had warned me about it, about the cursed objects that had been locked away in this very room, the very items that had been part of the occult rituals. And now the house was calling me to open it. My hands shook as I reached for the lid, every instinct telling me to turn and run, but I couldn't stop myself. I had come this far. I had to know. I had to see. With a creak that sounded far too loud in the silence, I opened the chest. At first, nothing. The chest was filled with old cloths, ancient and brittle with age, their texture strange under my fingers. But then, at the bottom, I felt something else. Something harder, cold, smooth. I pulled it out, a small, polished stone, dark and gleaming in the dim light. The stone was raw. There was no other word for it. It hummed with an energy that made my skin crawl. A strange, unsettling vibration that seemed to move under my fingertips. And then the basement shook. It wasn't just the walls. It was the very foundation of the house, groaning and cracking under the strain. The whisper turned into a scream, a sound that tore through my chest and rattled my bones. It felt as if the house was alive, breathing, waiting for something. Waiting for me. The stone slipped from my hands, falling to the floor with a sound like glass breaking. No, I shouted, panic rising in my throat. No, no, no. Before I could move, before I could reach for it, something changed. The air shifted again, colder this time, impossibly cold, like ice crawling under my skin. My breath fogged in the air as I turned, my eyes searching the dark corners of the room, looking for any sign of movement. It was then that I saw it. A figure, tall, shrouded in shadow, standing motionless in the corner of the basement. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. I could feel it watching me, its gaze heavy and unyielding. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot. It took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned beneath its weight. Leave now, or it will take you. The voice was louder now, more distorted, like 100 voices speaking at once, overlapping and blending into one deep, guttural tone. I felt it clawing at my mind, trying to drown me in its dark call. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. My throat was too tight, too constricted. The figure moved closer, its shape flickering like the shadow was made of smoke, swirling and twisting with every step. Kate grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We need to go," she shouted, her voice breaking, filled with terror. Now? I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I turned and ran, my legs feeling like lead, my heart in my throat. But the basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, trapping us inside. The air thickened, the pressure growing unbearable as the walls seemed to close in around us. Kate was already pulling at the door, screaming for it to open. Her fingers were raw, bloodied from the force of her tugging, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers became a cacophony of voices now, drowning out everything else. I turned, eyes scanning the room for any way out. The house felt like it was folding in on itself, like it was swallowing us whole. The walls were breathing. The floor creaked, groaned, and shuddered underfoot. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. I felt it first on my skin, cold, biting cold, and then I saw it. A pale mist swirling around us, thickening, wrapping itself around my legs, climbing up my arms as if the very air was alive, suffocating us. "Run!" Kate screamed, and this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait. I grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the stairs, but it was too late. From the corner of the room, something moved. A shape, dark and unnatural, rushing toward us with an unnatural speed. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, malicious eyes. I shoved Kate ahead of me, pushing her toward the stairs as I heard it. Footsteps, thundering behind us, growing louder, closer. We ran, our feet pounding against the stairs, the wood creaking under the pressure. We reached the top, gasping for breath, but the door, our only escape, was locked. I could feel the figure behind us, could hear its breath, hot and labored, just inches away. Kate scrambled at the door, her fingers frantic as she pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't open. It wouldn't give. And then I heard it. The sound of something heavy, something massive, moving behind us. I turned just in time to see it, dark and massive, a figure that seemed to fill the entire doorway. The shadow stretched out, a twisted, grotesque shape that was impossible to comprehend. It was tall, so tall, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The air around it crackled like static electricity buzzing in my ears. "Leave," the voice rasped again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream that rattled my bones. And then the house seemed to groan and shift. Before I could take another breath, before I could even process what was happening, the door burst open with a violent crash. We didn't hesitate. We bolted. We ran for the car, not looking back, not daring to. The darkness of the house seemed to reach out for us, trying to pull us back inside, but we were too fast, too desperate. When we reached the car, I slammed the door shut, the engine roaring to life in an instant. I didn't care where we went. I didn't care what happened next. All I knew was that we couldn't stay there. We couldn't ever go back. As I drove away, my hands shaking, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the house's gaze on me. It was still there, watching, waiting. And I knew, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the house would always be with me. Always. We didn't stop. We couldn't. As we drove away from the house, the road ahead blurred into nothingness, the headlights cutting through the dark, but my mind was consumed by a single suffocating thought. What if it followed us? Kate was silent beside me, her hands trembling on her lap, her face pale in the flickering glow of the dashboard lights. I wanted to say something, anything to reassure her, but I couldn't find the words. What was there to say? That we were safe now? How could I know? I could still feel the air thick with that unnatural cold, the weight of something malevolent pressing down on us from the moment we had stepped foot in that house. The house. It had felt alive, a presence that clung to us, that reached for us with its icy fingers, and I knew that we had only just scratched the surface of whatever horror it had to offer. But we were gone. Or so I told myself. The quiet in the car was stifling. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of the tires on the wet road. Kate broke the silence first. "Do you think is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might summon something out of the shadows. "I don't know," I muttered, keeping my eyes fixed on the road. "I don't know if it's ever really over." I tried not to think about the whispers, the scream of the house that seemed to echo in my ears even now. I tried to shut it all out, but it clung to me, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a shroud. The figure, the thing in the basement, the footsteps, none of it made sense. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little we actually knew. What had we stumbled into? Was the house cursed, or was it something more? Something older, deeper, a darkness that had always been there, waiting to claim its next victim? As we drove on, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a shadow. It was fleeting, just a flicker, but it made my heart skip a beat. I forced my gaze back to the road, swallowing hard, trying to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. "You saw it, didn't you?" Kate's voice was quiet, but sharp. "You saw something behind us." I didn't answer. I couldn't. But I knew. I knew what she meant. That shadow, that fleeting glimpse, it hadn't been a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks. I had seen something. I had felt it. "I don't think we're safe," I finally said, my voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "I don't think we ever will be." Kate didn't respond. She didn't need to. The weight of the words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. We drove in silence for what felt like hours. The road stretched on, endless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That the house was still with us. That whatever had been unleashed there had followed us. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the pressure, as the shadows outside seemed to twist and writhe in the corner of my vision. I told myself it was nothing, just the exhaustion, the fear, the lingering effects of everything we had just experienced. But then the temperature in the car dropped. I could see my breath misting in front of me, and Kate shuddered beside me, her hands rubbing her arms as if she were trying to stave off an unseen chill. The air felt heavier, thick with the same oppressive weight that had settled in the basement. "I'm not crazy, am I?" Kate's voice was shaking now. "You felt that, right? It's not just me?" "No," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "I felt it too." I didn't need to say any more. The feeling was undeniable. The cold, the weight, the presence, it was there inside the car with us. And it wasn't just in our heads. It was real. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. There it was. The shadow. Closer now. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was unmistakable, moving, shifting, as if something was following us. Something big. Something alive. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but nothing was there. "Stop!" Kate screamed, grabbing my arm. "Don't look." But I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the rearview mirror, to the shadow that was now inches away from us. I saw it, moving, undulating in the glass, its form growing larger, darker, closer. It was reaching for us. No, I muttered, my voice trembling. It's not real. But it was real. I felt the pressure in my chest, the cold creeping under my skin, and then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper coming from the back seat. Leave? My heart stopped. The shadow was no longer in the mirror. It was here in the car with us. I didn't wait another second. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward, hurtling down the road, faster, faster. The shadow receded, but the feeling, **, was still there just behind us, pulling us back toward that house, toward its darkness. The road stretched ahead, but I knew deep down that it didn't matter. I couldn't escape it. Not really. It was always going to be there. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the house would never let me go.